G'day mate, 40 here. Spiritual lesson number 1 for today. You collect a lot more money with a bat and a kind word than you do with just a kind word. That's a spiritual teaching from our very own sage, Rabbi Laponius Maximus, in the name of his Rebbe, the Lipped One. Words to live by, right? This is a metaphor. You can apply this to life. You collect a lot more money with a bat and a kind word than just a kind word alone. All right. So I was talking to a spiritual mentor of mine this morning, and I said to him, I'm watching the telly. I'm watching this documentary, Slaying the Badger, about the French, and I'm just filled with rage about the French. It's like I remember my trip to Paris, and I remember how they ripped me off every which way to Sunday. And I just start thinking, oh man, the French, they're just they're dishonest and they're disreputable people, and you can't trust them. And I don't like hating a whole group. It's just not who I am spiritually. And so my mentor said to me, well, what's your role? Like, what do you get out of it? I was like, oh, well, I am a bit of an Anglo-Saxon supremacist. So, okay, that's my role. And let's say I choose to do business with a crim, right? Choose to do business with a criminal type. And, I think, I'm protected. I got collateral, that I've investigated things. And then he rips me off, right? And now I hate his ethnic group, that apparently some members of his ethnic group have the motto, let's go out and commit fraud. Let's go do fraud, right? Some groups like to go play basketball. Other groups like to go study Talmud. But what about those groups who like to go do fraud? All right, so how do we relate to those groups? So obviously, we are completely entitled to, okay, I don't want to go do business with members of a group who have the attitude, let's go do fraud, right? But the key, my mentor told me, is acceptance, right? With pretty much every group, they're going to have beliefs and practices and habits and weaknesses that you find disgusting. And that's just the nature of life, and we can't change groups, right? So the key is acceptance. Okay, some groups do a lot of white-collar crime. Other groups are low achievers. Other groups do a lot of violent crime. Other groups tend to dominate in this area of life, and other groups tend to be subordinate in other areas of life. So I notice so many people right now are black-pilled. It's like, oh, the world's just getting worse and worse. There's no hope for the West. The West is doomed. America is doomed. Each generation seems to be morally degenerating. So I notice a large number of people on the right, on the left, over age 30, who are just filled with gloom and doom. And so I don't want to be like that. And I don't want to examine this very minute in my phone call with my mentor this morning, to the extent that this is valid. I just want to focus on the extent that this is not valid, that this is a projection from inside someone onto reality. And so my mentor said, well, once again, the key is acceptance, right? You can't change the world. You can't change the direction of Western civilization. You can't change how different groups behave. You can't change their practices or their beliefs. You can't change their rituals. You can't change their strengths and weaknesses. So a key to creating a life that works is acceptance, rather than raging about reality. Like, if you are unhappy because of the news, then you're not in acceptance. You're seeking control over things that you can't control. And then the other key question to ask is, okay, question number 1 is, do I accept reality? Am I willing to accept that which is true? Because as long as I deny that which is true, I am insane in that part of my life. And the second question is, what's my role? Like, do I have a chip on my shoulder? I notice people sharing videos because they're so convinced that Israel that Israel set off that enormous explosion in Beirut, that they're sharing on Twitter all these fake videos showing a missile strike, and the videos are doctored, but they have such a chip on their shoulder that Israel did this large explosion that they're sharing fake videos. So if you have a chip on your shoulder, so that as soon as something bad happens, you immediately assume it's the Israelis, or you immediately assume it's the Muslim Brotherhood, or you immediately assume that it's Al-Qaeda, right? That's not a characteristic of a life that works. Like, if Israel was responsible for this big explosion in Beirut, my happiness would not be diminished. I would not be ashamed to come on here. I'd be happy to discuss it. What's the evidence? Right now, it seems all the evidence is that it was an accident, and it was poor practices by whoever's in charge of Beirut. That the Beirut Port Authority kept requesting to move this ammonium nitrate out away from the port, and the higher-ups did not allow that, so this dangerous 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate just sat there right by Beirut's commercial hub and finally went off. So I haven't seen any strong evidence different from that. So if you have a chip on your shoulder that the Jews did it, or the Muslims did it, or the Al-Qaeda did it, or whoever you want to blame, that does not seem to be an effective path through life, that you have an emotional need for things to go a certain way. Simply too with the lockdown response to the pandemic. All right, so if upon reflection it turns out that this lockdown was way too harsh, all right, then I think I'd have emotional equanimity to discuss that, to bring those articles to your attention, to share those videos and podcasts with you, because I don't have an emotional attachment to Democratic politicians being wrong. And I don't have an emotional attachment to Republican politicians being right. Right? I want to welcome the truth from absolutely any source. And the more you get distracted from that kind of point of view, then the less spiritual growth there is. And I want to talk about, is there an objective, definable, generalizable definition of a life that works? Are there certain characteristics of a life that works as opposed to a life that doesn't work? And can we learn anything from it? And when we discuss this, what I don't want to do is go, oh, here are some examples from my life of a life that works, and try to frame the whole discussion so that I can feel good about my life with all its failures and frustrations, right? That's just feeding the ego. And there's no spiritual growth to be had from feeding the ego. For example, I just got an email a few minutes ago from an acquaintance. He wrote, you have a wide range of interests, but you also know how to focus. Your questions are expert and funny when called for. You hit the right admixture of entertainment and interesting information. You know when to apply the lash to your interlocutor. You're also funny when called for, and you give your guests time to develop their thoughts. See, if I share that email, that's just feeding my ego, right? So I'm not going to share that email, right? Why do I need to do that? There's no spiritual growth in feeding my ego. So I'm struck by, up until age 22, up until August of 1988, when I went away to UCLA, I venerated my father. Even though I was in an atheist phase, I still had very high regard for my father, and I did not take kindly to anybody who criticized him or dismissed him. I think that there are people in my family who would sometimes say negative words about my father, and I did not take kindly to that. So then suddenly I changed. Like, why did I go away to UCLA for 9 months? And my father didn't change during that time. And I went from venerating my father to having the attitude that he was an emotional cripple, right? My father didn't change. I dramatically changed. Like, why? Because I have this tendency to idealize or devalue people. Like, sometimes I put them up here on a pedestal. Like, I'm sure you know that as you watch my shows. Like, oh, I'm putting all these people up here on a pedestal. And then the next week, oh, I'm trashing them. was like, oh no, I put someone new on a pedestal, and then the next week I'm trashing them. Like these are characteristics of the narcissistic personality type. That's not really an approach to life that works. But anyway, I remember my father. He was an evangelical Christian theologian. He was both a learned academic with 2 PhDs, and he was also an evangelist. And when he'd get together with other evangelists, they'd compare how many people they'd baptized. And there's no inherent meaning to baptizing someone. Many people get baptized and their life doesn't change. All right. So with follow-up, perhaps you can spot whether someone's life changes. But if you're getting together with your fellow evangelists and you're just comparing numbers about how many souls you saved, how many people you baptized, right? That's just ego, right? There's nothing real there, right? People can take on Christianity and it doesn't change anything fundamental about them. People can take on Judaism, doesn't change anything fundamental about them. So generally speaking, I think a life that works is reasonably transparent, that you're able to maintain a consistent core through the different segments of your life. So for me, I have a life in Orthodox Judaism, I have life in my favorite Orthodox synagogues, I have an earning life, I have clients, I have my YouTube life, then I have life with my friends. And so is there any common core to all those lives, or am I changing fundamentally who I am, right? The more transparent I can be, the better. So I'm not saying anything on here that I'd be ashamed to share with my clients, with my friends, with the people at synagogue. So this kind of works through all phases of my life. So if you're having to hide who you are in one phase of your life, or if what you're doing in one phase of your life is detracting from other areas of your life, that's pretty clearly a life that doesn't work. So generally speaking, I think transparency is a characteristic of a life that works. And people who say, oh, I'm a very private person, what they really mean is I don't trust anyone. That doesn't seem to be an approach to life that works. But there's a saying in 12-step, you're only as sick as your secrets. But that doesn't mean you need to share everything with everyone. I mean, that saying in 12-step, you're only as sick as your secrets, that means that you share them with your sponsor or with people who are safe, right? So I particularly think with regard to sexual misconduct, things that you're ashamed of, like let's say you blew some dude under a bridge, right? That's probably not something you should share publicly. Like sexual misconduct is not something you should share publicly, because for most people, misconduct in this area of life, it is such a charged area that it will overwhelm every other way that they view you. So you get put into a box. You're the dirty old pervert. So in the sexual arena, definitely you don't want to share all your secrets. You don't want to share secrets that are going to distort people who don't know you very well. But on the other hand, you should have people that you can confide in, right? Like a therapist or a sponsor or somebody who's safe. Okay, I was having discussions today with friends. Is there any generalizable, objective definition of a life that works as opposed to, say, a life that doesn't work? And let me play a little bit here from historian Marc Shapiro.
A couple other things. I mentioned this incident was the last class or the class before, I believe, of holding up a knife, someone from the Peleg, the threat to the Rosh Yeshiva. So someone asked, we've done a lot of courses in Jewish history, have we had violence in yeshivas? Maybe it's in the news because of all the violence we have in this country right now. It's interesting, I think, because we have violence today. I mean, I've showed in the past, I showed videos of throwing chairs and crazy stuff going on in Bnei Brak and Ponevezh. There was even a stabbing there. But I have to say that in past years, even in the heights of the dispute in the yeshiva world, we basically, I'm not aware of any examples of any real violence, stabbings, killings, anything like that. We have some violence, Hasidim and Misnagdim, and we have some violence, Orthodox, Maskilim, Reform, but nothing like I mentioned in a blog post in Ponevezh in the 40s, someone joined the Irgun, and some people then in the yeshiva attacked him. They covered his face with a blanket, and they beat him. But basically, we have very, very little in the way of violence. It's sort of like a modern thing. But since I was asked, I will tell you something, which if you haven't heard of, it'll probably blow you away. And I'm not making it up. Here it is. It's my Talmud Yerushalmi. If you open up the Yerushalmi in Shabbos, Perek Aleph, Halacha Dalet, it talks about, in fact, the initial we're going to speak about in 1 minute when they made the decrees against Pasakum, etc. It talks about, this is page Tes Amud Aleph, if you have the standard edition. It talks about how between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and it talks about the feud they had here. And I'll read you the exact lashon here. It says that Beis Shammai was together Beis Shammai, Beis Shammai Amdu Lamata, V'hayu Hargin B'Talmidei Beis Hillel. The Yerushalmi tells us that there was a fight that took place between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and Beis Shammai, actually, some of them killed Beis Hillel, people in Beis Hillel. That's how violent it got. If you look in the Karban Eda on the spot, he's the standard commentator. He's the teacher of Mendelssohn, incidentally. The Karban Eda, he says he can't believe it. He says Chas v'shalom that they would do this. He sees it as an exaggeration. But if you look at many other commentaries, they take it as literal. So we do have an example of where Torah scholars can get so excited that they can be led to do terrible things. Speak poorly of the people who committed the murders, but maybe this is an example of people who were Torah scholars but didn't have any real ethics. They were just they could learn a lot, but because anyone who would pick up a knife and stab another person, obviously we have a problem. Two other things, just to give you the source, I mentioned last class about Rav Shechter, and I just to give you the exact thing about what he said to do for a chola who's by himself or herself. If you look on the YU website, and they sent out, he published about 25 different responses before Pesach, and let me just read you what he says. If a person were to leave the telephone on before Yom Tov and conduct the Pesach Seder from their home so that others can follow along, like Balei Tshuva who may not know how to run a Seder. So in other words, we're leaving our phones, I'm speaking into the phone, and the other person is listening. There may be reason to be lenient under great and pressing circumstances. So Rav Shechter allows a Seder with a telephone for such a person. He even includes a Baal Tshuva who's by himself and doesn't know how to run the Seder. But then he says, however, to leave a computer screen on and to have people watch it connect over the internet is a greater concern of violating Shabbos and Yom Tov since it creates images and pictures when the people move, etc., etc. Okay, but still, what he said was quite radical. He's not doing the Zoom, but I guarantee you, had those Moroccan rabbis came out and said do a telephone thing, they would have been attacked by the Haredi the same way that they were attacked for the Zoom. Because most people are not thinking like Rav Shechter halachically, well, a telephone is one thing, but the computer, you have screens and all that, they're just saying it's electricity. I guarantee you, everyone who said the Zoom is crazy, it's because they said it's electricity. Rav Shechter is saying that this could possibly be permitted, but the computer is not. So I find it interesting. And now let me show you something. You think this is just like a modern Orthodox or a centrist postsake? I want to show you something. You listen for 1 minute. I'm going to show you something on the screen. They call him the senior postsake of Lakewood. I don't know if everyone agrees he's the senior, but he's certainly a senior postsake. And he's speaking about hold on here. Hold on. He's speaking about, I have to share it again. I have to, so you can listen. He's speaking about people with addictions, alcohol and other things. And look, and he's very sensible. I think all sensible person would say it. But if this was someone else, I think they think you're crazy. But listen carefully to what he says. Senior postsake in Lakewood.
I've passed this in the past, Lamaisa. And I want to make it clear now that anybody in recovery, anybody doing a step work and has a chashash that he needs help, he has to make sure that his recovery is rock solid. He has a chashash that he has to call a meeting, call into a Zoom meeting, attend the meeting, call up a sponsor, whatever, shouldn't make any chashoshes, shouldn't make any cheshbonis. He has to make sure not to start on that slippery slope. Forget about Shabbos, forget about Yom Tov, forget about Yom Kippur. You have to make that call, you have to log on, you have to attend. You must avoid that slippery slope. David should bench us all, have achmanas on all of his Yiddish kinder.
So here, I mean, you find this leading postsake in Lakewood saying that if you're in some sort of AA or something like that, you get on the phone. You do what you have to do. Very, very interesting.
So how did you like that old Orthodox rabbi in Lakewood? A postsake is a rabbi who renders decisions on Jewish law. And he says if you're an addict, you have to put your sobriety first. That is more important than the laws of Shabbat. It's more important than the laws of Yom Kippur. If you need to call your sponsor, if you need to log on to a Zoom meeting, what you need to do for your recovery, that has to come first, because only once you have recovery, can you then go on to participate effectively in other areas of your life? I thought that was sweet. Let me look at the chat. The more you define your self-image, the better your life is, says Jen. The more your environment and your circumstance define your self-image, the worse. Yeah, the more you have an internal locus of control. So if I depend upon the chat to tell me who I am or what type of show I should do, that's not going to be as effective for me as if I have an internal locus of control whereby I can listen to feedback, but I don't have to be a servant of it. So a lot of people who start publicly producing blog posts or social media production or videos or podcasts, they become captured by their audience and they become increasingly extreme because that's where they get the most applause. And so they lose a sense of boundaries, they lose themselves, they lose their traditional understanding of right and wrong as they go chasing the applause. Even if the West gets ever more diverse, you can still become rich and live in a gated community to stay away from the negative impacts of diversity. Well, if you've got some big waves coming in, so to speak, you can either sit there moaning about these big waves that are coming in that are inevitably going to wash over you, or you can learn to handle big waves. Or you can gather with people and make plans. Okay, we need to construct something so that we limit the effect of these mountainous waves. We want to keep like a safe area. So we're gonna need to build something. But right now, with these waves on the horizon, we're not going to be able to build something in time. So do we want to learn to surf? Do we want to learn to swim? Do we want to learn to be flexible enough to deal with the surus, the troubles that are coming our way? Yeah, it's better to be addicted to reading books than being addicted to drugs. Is streaming Walker Connor for 35 straight days a life that works? Well, if you enjoy doing it and there are no negative externalities, there are no negative side effects, then I don't see any problem with whatever topic you want to stream on. So I'm thinking, what are some objective standards here for a life that works? I'm thinking being able to track your time, right? I remember when I used to look at pornography, like the minutes and then hours would just go by at times, right? That's not a life that works when you're not keeping a track of your time, when you're not in control of your time, but you just get absorbed in something that's not good for you and it just goes on and on and on. Or you get on the phone and you spend way much more time on the phone call than what is appropriate for where you're at that day or with that person. So I'd say tracking your time, being on top of your time, tracking your spending, tracking your earning, being aware of your bills, paying your bills on time. To me, those are all examples of a life that works. Tracking. You need to track, you need to plan, and you need to track. So you need to have a realistic plan, goal. For example, I won't take any work that pays less than $45 an hour. So I have that clarity. So if an earning opportunity came up, but it only paid $40 an hour, I'm not going to take it. So I know how much money is coming in. I know what my bills are. And I know how I spend my time. So my time is all slotted out. The first hour of my day is prep and 12th step. Then the next 90 minutes of my day is usually divided. I have 2 sponsees for 45 minutes each. Then usually I'm earning money between about 8 a.m. and noon. And then after noon, I'm preparing for the show. Then after the show, I'm calming down, reading a book, watching a documentary. And so I have my time planned. And then I also track my time. On top of that, I have my earning and my spending plan. And then I check my bank balance every day. I weigh myself every day. So I want to be under 170, and I'm currently about 171. When I get up to 174, I am not very happy about that. But I want to be on track of my weight every day. I want to be on track of my bank account every day. Jay Walker says, Luke, will you help edit my book for $44 an hour? Nope. Sorry. Nothing No new clients under $45 an hour. That's the minimum. I'm not going to teach Alexander technique for less than $100 an hour. So certain types of earning opportunities are more easy or more pleasant. So I'll take down to an amount to $45 an hour, but I'm not going to go under that. So I'd say tracking and planning are essential for a life that works. I don't see how you can build a life that works where you don't track and you don't plan your time, your money. All right. What's another idea? Another symptom of a life that works? That is, you're open to new ideas. Like, you're open to good ideas. How long do I usually prepare for the show? Explicit preparation, 30 minutes to an hour, but probably spend 4 hours a day reading. So probably 3 hours a day reading books, another hour a day reading newspapers. So during that time, I'll often spot things that I want to talk about on the show. But when I watch a TV show or a movie, if there's a little bit there that I want to share on the show, I'll jot that down. Dooovid, when you bought me my microphone, you said that there was some level of 12 steps, and that was largely where you bought me the mic. I don't believe that. I bought you the mic because you're a very significant contributor to the show. So that wasn't charity. That was for a better quality show because it gave us better quality audio. So I didn't buy you a mic out of the kindness of my heart. I bought you a mic because I recognized what an important contribution you made to the show. Isn't too much openness a recipe for disaster? Some people can't handle too much openness. Absolutely. So you don't want to be open too much, but you don't want to be closed too much either. So, for example, I won't take any new work that pays less than $45 an hour, right? So I am not open to work that pays me less than $45 an hour. So work over $45 an hour, as long as it's legal and honorable, I am open to it. Right, so if you're insecure, if you feel bad about yourself, you will tend to deflect ideas. If you just automatically and compulsively reject ideas that could expand your life or your career, increase your profit, then I think that's a symptom of a life that doesn't work. Okay, here's a big one: compulsive need to prove. Right? If you've got a compulsive need to prove, that's an example of a life that doesn't work. If you're constantly trying to prove something, you've got a chip on your shoulder, to me, that's an example of a life that doesn't work. So if you're constantly driven to reprove your worth and your value and to show off to people and to get back at people, so you've got some resentment, some burn against people, to me, that's an example of a life that doesn't work. Let's get a little bit more from Marc Shapiro.
And finally, the kashrus of the fish in South Africa, it's the king clip. That's the one. I found it out. Last thing I want to say is we ended with Schefter and Malcolm, if you're on with me, yes, I get it. There's still some Sephardic Psaki Piskei Halacha, which even the yeshiva world they listen to, but we dealt with Pas Palter, actually. And I thought, so a number of people emailed me things about this, again, to remind you what was said, that non-Jewish bread we're not supposed to eat, but not allowed to, but, well, generally not. But Pas Palter, if it's from a bakery, then we're allowed to, according to the Ramah. Generally, you're allowed to, according to the Ramah. Others are more machmir. They say unless it's a it has to be more expensive, the kosher bread, etc. But the Ramah is matter. So when I asked for Schechter going in Europe eating bread, he said.
So this is important. When rabbis rule whether something is kosher or not, they take into consideration your economic circumstance. So the more dire your economic circumstance, generally speaking, the more easygoing they are going to be with their rulings. So that's something that we need to take into consideration in our lives, that circumstance determines right and wrong. Right? There are both universal standards for right and wrong and situational. Ethics are both universal and situational because the situation determines the ethical standard. If you are desperately poor, you're in a different situation than if you're well off, and that's going to determine what your options are.
That only a Shas HaChak. But we're generally, I said I found it interesting because we generally don't assume only in a Shas HaChak, and then we raise the issue of the different hashkachas on breads, Arnold's bread, etc. So what years to the Sephardics, or in terms of Humdus? It's no comparison. Someone who listens even sent me an article that appeared in my Kor Rishon where he has, don't don't make ha'etz on.
So this is Marc Shapiro talking about whether the Sephardim and the Mizrahim need affirmative action with regard to the leading yeshivas, entrance to
It's
the
not so
leading
simple. When we were
Jewish
in
Talmudic
school, they
academies.
told us that the potato chips hadama, but Pringles shahakol.
So there he's talking about what's the appropriate blessing. There's a different one for potato chips and there's a different one for Pringles.
David Eisen says we make a shakal on all beverages except wine based on Tosot. The bracha on beer is also shakal and not mazonot, since the majority is water, and accordingly no bishalakum issues. That is the minhag, but the Panim Eros did not accept that, and he held that you make on tea. He also said on tea you make hadama, and if you look in the arguments, he makes sense. He's a very learned person. I don't think today there's anyone who holds what he says. Do I want a quota affirmative action for Sephardic, Svarim, and Ashkenazic yeshivas? What about a strimel? No affirmative action. You have to you have to bring yourself up. And I'll be the first to admit it, although maybe this is going to get me canceled. You can't compare the Svarim, the Ashkenazic Svarim in recent years to the Sephardic Svarim in terms of lumdus. There's no comparison. Someone who listens even sent me an article that appeared in Makar Rishon where you have Sephardic Rosh Yeshiva saying that themselves. And yeshivas today are understood, not halacha l'maisa, anything like that. They're understood in terms of lumdus. So if you want lumdus, you don't have anything in recent years in the Sephardic world.
So lumdus refers to scholarship, traditional Jewish scholarship. So he's pointing out that all the great scholars in Orthodox Judaism over the last 20 years have been Ashkenazi.
Or Chaim or any of the other Litvish Hamdanim. You do have earlier on. So no affirmative action there. I think it's only knowing who sent the question. I know it's only tongue in cheek. Barry says the dispute arose in Chicago when Rav Aaron wanted to rescind smicha from musmach to shul without a mechitza. That was even more problematic, I have to say. I'm a big fan of Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, and you'll hear next week.
So a mechitza is the separation between men and women in an Orthodox shul.
One of the long discussions I had with him. But these musmachim, for instance, unless he had a grandfather clause, they were going on a long tradition in Skokie, and a heter given by Rabbi Regensburg, who was...
So a heter is a rabbinic permission.
One of the leading rabbanim in Chicago, and the posek at the Skokie Yeshiva, or a posek there, that gave permission for them to take the traditional shuls. And even afterwards, it's his brother, the Rav, sent people to take shuls without a mechitza. Rav Aaron he did have a big battle with the conservatives and anything that approached that. He didn't want to allow it.
So generally speaking, Orthodox rabbis would not take synagogues that did not have a mechitza. That was their standard. Okay, let's think more about characteristics of a life that works versus a life that doesn't work. So clinging to useless possessions, like if you're a hoarder, right? That's not a life that works. Alternating between exertion and exhaustion. So you exert yourself, exhaust yourself, overwork, you become thoroughly frazzled, then you underwork or cease work completely. So swinging between such extremes, to me, that's a characteristic of a life that doesn't work. Related to being indifferent about your time, so giving away your time when there's no clear benefit. So you're just giving it away. It's not furthering your values. It's not furthering anything that you care about, but you're just compulsively volunteering, compulsively helping people, compulsively getting obsessed with other people's lives instead of your own. That's an example of a life that doesn't work. Undervaluing your abilities and your services and fear, asking for increases in compensation for what the market will bear. So if you consistently sell yourself short, there will be no end of people who will take advantage of you. Isolation, right? Characteristic of a life that doesn't work is you spend a tremendous amount of time alone. I notice that the more time I spend alone, that the more likely I am to get a chip on my shoulder, to be antisocial, to be careless, to be sloppy, to develop kind of a negative or an eccentric way of thinking and living. So isolation does not tend to lead to a life that works. I'm thinking I'm about 20% happier, probably 10% more cognitively alive and probably 10 to 20% more energetic because I take modafinil. So is that cheating? I take a pill every morning, and as a result, I think I'm about 20% happier, considerably more energetic, and more intellectually and cognitively alive. So to me, that's not cheating. That's just taking advantage of what life has revealed to me. So this is a drug with virtually no side effects, no street value, no addictive quality, and it's been around for many decades. So we have no reason to believe that there's a large downside to using it. Instead, there's a substantial upside. So when we find something that significantly contributes to our life, then why would we not take advantage of it? On the other hand, I know most people over 40 have some difficulty sleeping, but most don't do anything particular about it, right? So if you've got like some kind of chronic problem, say your feet hurt, or you're not sleeping well, or you're overweight, and you don't deal with it, you don't take care of it, to me, that's an example of a life that doesn't work. So I notice that I'm better off being on the zone diet, making sure that I eat enough protein with every meal. Right? That's just part of taking good care of myself. I notice when I eat protein, I'm mentally sharper. I feel good. I just perform at a higher level if I eat enough protein. Sleep machines, sleep apnea machines. Yeah, if you have sleep apnea, if you snore, then you should get it checked out. You should have an overnight sleep test, and you should do what you need to do. So I've struggled with my sleep since my 20s, and I just keep trying new things to improve it, becoming, how do I get protein without meat? So I drink kefir in the morning, Kefir. That's quite high in protein. I have a protein drink every morning. It's got about 24 grams of protein versus, say, 4 grams of carbs and, 8 grams of fat. So that's my breakfast. So I'm off to a good protein start to my day. Then for lunch, I'll have a few potatoes, which are just pure carbs, but I will pile on top of them cottage cheese, guacamole, hummus, peanut butter. All these things are high in protein. Then I eat a lot of nuts, so they're pretty high in protein. Then I love Mexican food. So guacamole, it's got proteins. Cheese has protein. Sour cream has protein. And then as snacks, I have snacks lying around that are essentially protein bars. And I have smoothies where I put in a cup of protein powder that's like 20 grams of protein with my smoothie. So I'm not eating a high protein diet. So I'm eating considerably less than 20 grams, less than 200 grams of protein a day. So I'm probably consuming about 100 grams of protein a day. So getting sufficient protein every meal, cottage cheese is an excellent source. That helps me just feel much better and work and think and live just at a more efficient way. Okay, often out of fear of being larger or exposed or more public, we experience physical ailments. So if you get a headache every time you should go to your acting class, or if you start getting a sore throat every time you think about live streaming, right, you've got some physical ailments that you're allowing to hold you back in life. Misplaced guilt or shame. We feel uneasy when asking for or being given what we need or what we are owed. So feelings of shame, to me, are characteristics of a life that doesn't work. About 20 years ago, I took on the understanding that given who I was at the time, I could not have acted differently. And as a result of that, I've experienced almost no regret. So I think if you're lugging through a large amount of regret in life, that is a characteristic of a life that doesn't work. Right? You don't want to be filled with regret and with shame. But once you understand, hey, I didn't ask to be a porn addict. I didn't ask to be an alcoholic. I didn't ask to be a debtor. I didn't ask to have these emotional addictions. I didn't ask to be born with these predilections. You don't have to beat yourself up for whatever shameful activity you engaged in when you're in the grip of your addictions. So when you understand that you did the best you could to meet your needs with what resources you had at the time, then you don't have to beat yourself down for your decisions. So a life filled with shame and regret, to me, that's an example of a life that doesn't work. So we've got Dooovid coming onto the show. So, Dooovid, have you heard anything that you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, almost everything you said was pretty interesting, especially talking about vegetarian diet, because I've been a vegetarian now for many years, largely due to Hinduism. But I know a lot of, because I distribute food at the temple. I volunteer, and I'm usually doing the food distribution, actually serve food, that there's a sizable amount of Seventh-day Adventists that either became Hare Krishnas or at least go to the temple on regular occasion because of vegetarianism. And it's hard to be a vegetarian, like getting enough protein, balanced diet. I know people that, God forbid, were in the hospital for like the B12 shortage or whatever. So that is an important topic. And but you got me hooked on the Jewish studies. Like I spent hours and hours the last few days just reading articles, and like I see, like what we're talking about was more interesting to me than like sitting in front of a Talmud and learning Daf Yomi. Like thank God I've learned Daf Yomi now. I finished Shas. If I went back to yeshiva or to the Orthodox place, it's not the same as like what we're doing here, and hopefully we could create a little bit of an appetite for it. And unfortunately, I think it's this concept of orthodoxy is problematic because it means that we can't, just speak to each other, because like there's orthodoxy and there's, who's actually saying what's correct, as opposed to more open flow. And then, Jennifer, if she's still in the chat, I think that our selection is a big factor. That if it's just me and Luke talking about it, it's different than when you're our selected and you got a whole bunch of kids in the system and you're basically handing your kids off to the rabbis to some extent. And I'm happy to talk about anything interfaith, economism, a few of the things I mentioned, or this concept I was telling you kind of how I see it is that you're really only as good as the rabbi you get behind. So when you're in yeshiva, you're studying, it's like, okay, like we venerate the rabbis. And if you want to be big in the Jewish community, you got to, be from the big rabbis. And you could be a businessman, a scholar of various sources. But from my understanding, like you really are only as big as the rabbi you get behind. And then, I mentioned some stuff on like Mary Trump and Trump in the perspective, like Donald Trump does not know rabbis. At the Hanukkah gathering, President Trump butchered Mayor Soloveitchik's name, and he told everyone he was going to butcher it. I mean, I could probably find the clip if it was interesting, but he's like, Mayor, he's like, oh, there's no way I'm going to get this one right. But like, you're like, you guys don't care because I'm doing what you want anyways. And Donald Trump was a wealthy man who did thousands and thousands of business deals. So even Dooovid knows Orthodox Jews that did business deals with, Donald Trump, the legendary mortgage broker, Moshe Majewski, or, diamond dealer Moshe Laks. But like relatively to the thousands and thousands of business deals that Donald Trump did, there are probably hundreds of Orthodox Jews that did business deals with Donald Trump. So it's an interesting dynamic. Most people know Orthodox Jews through doing business with us, not through like, our philosophy or interfaith or activism. And if we do activism, usually it's pretty like behind the scenes and just dealing with a person. But like, if you're in an urban area, it's very likely you do business regularly with Orthodox Jews. And Orthodox Jews, like at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how wealthy you are. We have to fall behind rabbis, and we're only as powerful as the rabbi we fall behind. And you say, okay, like I'm a follower of the Lubavitch Rebbe. He was like almost Messiah. If you're going to fall behind a rabbi, to some extent, the default is the Lubavitch Rebbe. Like I could say, like I follow the Rebbe. Luke could say he follows the Rebbe, and it's kind of indicative of a defense of our lifestyle. And probably, either one, me or Luke could give a defense that, like, yeah, I followed the Rebbe. Basically, I try to do what the Rebbe recommended. And but like, if you're in a modern Orthodox place, it's going to be the Rav, and there's various people. I'm not sure if that's an interesting dynamic to you, or any of these topics that we've been looking at.
Yeah, let me just grab one of them. Let's just talk about business ethics. I noticed from being to a lot of different types of synagogues that really only modern Orthodox congregational rabbis talk about business ethics to their congregation. That generally speaking, Hasidic rabbis and Haredi rabbis don't lecture their congregations about business ethics, but because the modern Orthodox live so much in the Gentile world, and because they disproportionately belong to professions that all have ethical codes, that their rabbis place a tremendous emphasis on conducting oneself ethically, particularly in business. But I don't hear Haredi rabbis or Hasidic rabbis preaching to their congregations about the importance of ethical business practices, particularly with regard to non-Jews. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think from the dynamic, I think it's actually been learning with you that made me see this by kind of looking at streaming as like a pulpit rabbi. And when you're like modern Orthodox, maybe there's an ethic, like you're kind of intermixed with the Goyim. But if you're in the more, sort of Orthodox or Haredi area where the majority of the people don't really have that many dealings with Goyim, and it's only the businessmen or a select group of people, and it could be, it's 30% of the adult men. But if only 30% of the adult men are having regular dealings with Goyim, even if it's 60% of the adult men, still the majority of the community is rather isolated. So the message of the rabbis in the Haredi community is never going to be geared towards the person who deals with the Goyim. It's going to be geared towards the larger community that's basically separate from the Goyim and living their own lifestyles. That's why, so you could have favorite rabbis of millionaires, and you could have businessmen who ask the rabbi, and I think it has to be that way, just as a social dynamics. Like, see, whether it's Detroit, New York, L.A., or Israel, and even if it was a Seventh-day Adventist or an Islamic society or like a Hindu society, it's probably also similar, where the internal community that basically lives the lifestyle, keeps all the rules, and the public leaders who internally speak to that group. And then you have your adult males that go off and do business and dealings with other people. And so obviously me and Luke are those people who are, dealing with the Goyim, and we're as opposed, like, we're not going to give a speech. There's no real scenario where me and you would be giving a speech to a group of Orthodox people. Like, what we have to say, in essence, just isn't useful to them. But if they wanted to deal with the Goyim, like, then all of a sudden, like, Dooovid or Luke could be extremely useful to them.
Right. So my father had this saying that I found tremendously useful. The problem is not that life doesn't make sense. It is that it doesn't make perfect sense. And I think that's just such a great comment, because there are certain generalizable rules for living that work. And when you violate them, your life tends to run into problems. But there are no rules to which there are no exceptions. So you can't expect a perfect correlation, say, between an upright life and a happy life. You can't expect that every wicked person is going to be miserable. You can't expect that every righteous person is going to succeed. Generally speaking, I think the righteous are more happy than the wicked. I think, generally speaking, those who treat other people decently and honorably are treated better in return. But it's just that these rules don't work out perfectly. So there are exceptions, but I do think there are generalizable rules to life. And that, generally speaking, life does make sense. It just doesn't make perfect sense. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, the Rabbi Emeritus of a local modern Orthodox synagogue, Rabbi Goldberg, Kids Kicking Cancer, might be even internationally famous, had a similar statement where he said, I think it came from a conversation, like someone said, but he said, a perfect God made an imperfect world perfectly. And I even have his book, but it's a little... tongue twister. A perfect God made an imperfect world perfectly.
So I want to go back to this terrific book by Jewish scholar Aaron W. Hughes, who wrote a book on theorizing Islam and religious studies post 9/11. He notes for much of the past 40 years, scholars of religion have largely tended to look upon their department colleagues who specialize in Islam with some degree of bewilderment and amusement. Their sparse numbers, often one scholar of Islam per religious studies department, and their highly technical, philological training in other fields such as Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, or Islamic studies often generated a set of methodological and theoretical interests perceived to be far removed from the academic study of religion. This has resulted in a rather tenuous and complicated relationship between the study of Islam and broader religious studies. All of this, however, changed radically after September 11, 2001. Islam's involvement in the attacks that day suddenly thrust this religion into the spotlight, revealing that our larger field is truly at the mercy of global events and directly proportionate to where our troops are. Scholars of Islam, or Islamists, as they are often called, suddenly became a highly sought-after commodity. Hundreds of jobs opened up, students flocked to courses, programs were created, and Islamists have increasingly become important players within the American Academy of Religion, the AAR, North America's largest organization devoted to the academic study of religion. The academic study of Islam has become more, not less, insular and apologetic since 9/11. It is within this latter apologetic context that scholars of Islam have presented themselves to their colleagues, to the media, and to the general public as the de facto interpreters of Islam. They have largely invoked their authority to elevate their particular and idiosyncratic interpretation of Islam, that it is very liberal and egalitarian, over other interpretations, and in the process deemed their version to be authentic and normal. On one level, given the anger and hostility directed toward Islam and Muslims, this is certainly understandable. Many Islamists have tried to correct the blatant and often hostile misrepresentations that frequently circulate in both the media and public opinion. However, on another level, problems inevitably arise when, to correct such misrepresentation, the only Islam that is presented as normative is the one they have largely constructed in their own image. The declaration of any Islamic social or identity formation as the authentic one risks overlooking or marginalizing the complex processes whereby competing Islams or interpretations of Islam interact and confront with one another. Instead, we have these professors at Western universities presenting a liberal Islam, one whose message is largely defined by tolerance, gender justice, and a universal respect for human rights. While I certainly do not doubt that there are Muslims and versions of Islam to which these virtues can be ascribed, it is a problem to use these as the sole criteria whereby an authentic Islam is constructed. So I was reading this and I was thinking about a lot of parallels to the academic study of Judaism. Dooovid, any thoughts?
Yeah, I liked being in university, and if it wasn't for the lockdown, I would probably be going to events at university every once in a while. And I liked Islamic studies. I prayed even a few times with my Islamic brothers in university. I went to their events and I read some of their literature. And Islam at university is much different than Islam in, so to say, Detroit. So when I deal with Islam in Detroit, I do interfaith, and it's much different. But when I was in university and dealing with Muslim students, one thing, it's usually non-sectarian, a lot of times just like Jews, that you have one prayer service for all the Muslims, and that will include people from Malaysia, non-Arabs, Sunnis, Shiites, because that's just how the university works. But if you went to Dearborn here near my house, most of the mosques are sectarian. And interesting, the mosque in the wealthiest neighborhood, thank God, near where my parents live, is actually non-sectarian, and it's more economical. That it's a mosque for rich people of all sects. But in the mainstream Islamic neighborhood in Detroit, almost all the major mosques are completely divided by national and sectarian lines. So I find it fascinating. I don't really deal with Muslims that much. I think if you're, in the business world and in the city, you might deal with them more. And just to conceptualize, to understand our Judaism, that almost all of these concepts could be separated from Islam and directly applied to Judaism.
And you threw a term into the chat, Shtadlan, who's essentially an intercessor for a local Jewish community. So academic studies of Islam, usually people are doing that very thing. They're at the university, supposedly they're scholars, but they're acting more in terms of apologetics. They're working more on behalf of the interests of their community. And this is kind of like this Hebrew term you mentioned in the chat. You want to talk more about it, Dooovid?
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole show on Shtadlanut, and historically, court Jews are possibly similar to Shtadlanut. I think I even sent you an academic paper about that. But it's basically someone who intercedes for the Jewish community on behalf of the with the Goyim on behalf of the Jewish community. And a lot of times these people are self-appointed. And I saw one article, what's the difference between an informant and a Shtadlanut? Saying like if you succeed in what you do of the Goyim is good for the Jewish community, you're a Shtadlanut. If your attempts to intercede for the community with the Goyim backfires and hurts the Jewish community, you're an informant. So it's kind of a practical type thing where it's like if Luke arises and becomes this big personality, he's a Shtadlanut. But if something it's more interpretive. And then said within the internal Jewish community, people who live the lifestyle have different concerns, and then you have to protect the community, and then the concerns of the people who deal with the Goyim in business or interaction. And now in academic studies is probably the main hall where these battles are fought. Like obviously in town center and the business market is the main place, but in the academic halls, and to some extent, no one cares what any studies department says. What these people are there for is largely to make students of their own group feel safer. So there might, like the Jewish studies department at University of Michigan, like the average course has like 5 people in it. And like very rarely, like you'll have a handful of Goyim, and they have like tons and tons of courses, but it's basically like wealthy people that pay academics to do research that nobody ever reads, and to make Jewish students on campus feel more comfortable and proud of their Judaism. And in Islam, it will serve largely the exact same purpose. Church of Entry, I've done a lot of interest into Hindu studies. So as of now, generally it's considered that professors of Hindu studies are actually anti-Hindu. And so to say, okay, University of Michigan doesn't have a Marc Shapiro. Like they're all secularist, Yiddishist. And from some perspective, you say like, no, I mean, the University of Michigan Department of Judaic Studies, like its mission is to be anti-Orthodox and is to, push the Goyim to, look in a different view of Judaism than what the sages are going to tell you. Scranton, you might have, different audience where and it's largely about money. Like my supplication, like Shapiro might be a good guy and find this interest, but like he largely wrote his book because that's his job. That's what he gets paid to do. He's a professor. He has to publish. It's the career path he chose. But on a very practical level, he probably represents the Jewish students on his campus if he's a good professor and there's students coming in, and he's talking about concerns of people who are trying to make it. And relative, it's probably like we talked about, most Jews think the world is rigged against us, when relatively the world is rigged in favor of us. So if you're a Jewish student on campus, you have a lot of things to help you succeed and get ahead. You don't have so many of those if you're a Muslim student on campus. So you might have like one Muslim professor who's representing you to the Goyim, and like most of the Goyim think like your religion's bad and backwards and going to lead to violence. And you got one professor that is going to stand up at a conference of like a Jew and a Christian and the president of the university and defend your religion. So it's these small groups that is actually pretty important for what me and Luke are concerning. Are talking about is probably more important what happens in these academic studies halls, in these ecumenical councils, than in Orthodoxy, because like Orthodoxy will never participate in that. And so the dealing with Orthodoxy is always going to be largely through politics and business. There's never so it's an interesting dynamic.
Right, and it's going to be business that has a tremendous amount of interaction with the non-Jews. So, for example, Jews don't tend to be in petroleum. They don't tend to be in the utilities. They tend to be in businesses that interact with non-Jews, such as landlord, such as selling diamonds or electronics, or they're in the professions such as doctor, lawyer, accountant, dentist. Let me play a little bit from a podcast interview with scholar Aaron W. Hughes. Oh, and wouldn't you know, it just froze on me. Let me try it again. Here we go. All right.
That everyone in Islamic religious studies is doing bad. There are so many interesting, highly specialized works that are produced by scholars of Islamic religious studies. And that's not I'm not trying to level my critique against those people, although sometimes I think they still use terms like religion, experience, and Islam in ways that I think need to be nuanced more. My main critique is the way we talk about Islam in the introductory classroom, which is where the majority of our teaching goes on, and the majority of our energies are expended at the university, and the ways in which the scholars of Islam really apologize for Islam, which I guess on many levels, there's probably nothing wrong with apologizing for your tradition. But I think that it's very important to be aware at what point one is being a theologian, speaking within the tradition, and at what point one is speaking about the tradition. So I always think that in this religious studies classroom, or Islamic religious studies classroom, like the university more generally, we have to be...
Okay, Doov is touching on something important there. So let me ask you, how much of the time when you come on a live stream, do you feel like you're just trying to make the very best possible presentation for your group, as opposed to just sharing what you believe is true?
Well, probably both. So, I built up my reputation, as a streamer, and like, not really with these streams that we've been doing recently, but, the bigger debates like JF or Adam Green and the various things. And I tried to be honest and admit, to say like Jews are just going to Jew, and if you got a problem with that, like so be it. But at the same time, be honest, and my whole purpose, as you said, was largely somewhat to defend the Jews. But I guess, my approach was through, somewhat honesty and truthful. So it's like, okay, I'll make that concession that, like, maybe Kant's critique on that we have an instrumental view towards truth, or, even to like Adam Green about these, like, things like, yeah, so what? So what if I think at the end of the days, like, the Goyim are going to be my slaves? Like, so what? What if I actually believe that? And so, maybe that made a unique YouTube personality. And I think an actual conversation, that if you were in an urban area and actually talking with Hasidim and Orthodox Jews, like on a street level, that's probably like how we sound like. We would be more forefront. Is like, yeah, okay, we believe this. So what? What are you going to do? Beat me up?
And there was a question in the chat yesterday: would you fly on an airplane where the pilot was high on marijuana?
I don't know enough about air pilots. I haven't actually flown for a long time, so I'm not an expert enough. Like, I definitely would be happy to drive. Like, and there's a difference between, like, smoking, getting high, like smoking blunts and blunts and blunts, and driving and smoking a little bit. And I think you could give the comparison. You're saying driving is some sort of like to a sport. If you were asking like basketball players or UFC fighters or any of these professions where there's a very high percentage of people that smoke marijuana, and would give similar explanations for how it benefits them.
And do you have an opinion on affirmative action?
I'll say no opinion. Like, this is basically no opinion. I've thought about it. Like, I've read the critical literature. But at the end of the day, like, no, I don't have a solution. I don't have a prescription. I don't have a side I'm pushing for.
And do you have much experience with the Sephardim and the Mizrahim and their approach to Judaism?
Less, but yeah, like I was in Borough Park, and there's a sizable Sephardi community. I mean, vast minority, relative, to hundreds of thousands of mostly, Hasidic Orthodox Jews. And then maybe there's thousands of Sephardim, And I was in Shomer Shabbos, different events. I've dealt with a lot of Spartam. I worked for Spartam, famous one. People, Yossi Piamenta, of blessed memory, the guitarist. I worked for him. I helped promote his shows and various things, and some of his family members were in the construction business, and and I worked for Iranian Jew in building permits. In 47th Street, I met and dealt with Spartam all the time, and even in my modern Orthodox circles, there's Spartam that are pray at Ashkenazic modern Orthodox places, and the Spartam in the greater Detroit community, I'm familiar with, but on a general day-to-day basis, I was more Ashkenazi tiered, and I didn't. In the last few, COVID, I'm not really dealing with anybody.
Okay, so I was having conversations with a friend today, and he said, "Luke, I don't get your approach to a life that works. Seems like a tautology. Bernie Madoff had an approach to life that worked until it didn't. How does that mean anything? Dennis Prager is on his third wife. Someone would say that's an approach to life that does not work unless you're cynical. Rabbi Marc Schneier has congregants who love him while he's on wife number 6 because he does important work doing interfaith with Muslims. So does his approach to life that works." Let me read a little bit from Tablet Magazine. And they profiled Marc Schneier on a couple of occasions. In 2016, they wrote, "Why was Rabbi Marc Schneier honored for Jewish American History Month?" Rabbi Marc Schneier is a polarizing figure to his supporters, the Yeshiva University-educated founder of the Hampton Synagogue, that's in New York State, is a peerless institution builder and community leader. To his detractors, he's indulged an appetite for fame and wealth while plowing his way through 5 marriages, destroying fragile bonds of trust with his congregants in the process. The rabbi has a complicated public persona. How do you weigh decades worth of work building bridges between Jews and Muslims, Jews and blacks, reportedly to the point of attempting to meet secretly with Louis Farrakhan, against the alleged abandonment of a wife and 2-year-old child for an Israeli ex-flight attendant 20 years younger than him? Yes, Marc Schneier created the thriving Hampton Synagogue out of nothing, partly thanks to help from Steven Spielberg, among other wealthy donors. He fostered a vibrant Jewish enclave within one of New York Metro region's fortresses of Gentile life. Then there's his record of infidelity. The 2011 request from the Orthodox Rabbinical Council of America that Marc Schneier resign his post, and now his resignation is reported by the Post effective at the end of the year. Schneier was honored during a May 25 Capitol Hill event as one of 6 outstanding Jewish Americans who have greatly enriched the fabric of American life as part of the U.S. Senate's celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month. And the organizer, Ezra Friedlander, a publicist, says that Marc Schneier's private life didn't have any bearing on his record of achievement in intercommunal relations, which was the whole reason for his award. So Marc Schneier is the co-author of Shared Dreams, a book about Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationship with the American Jewish community. He founded the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, an intercommunal relations group that counts hip-hop mogul Russell Simmons among its board members. And he does a lot of outreach with Muslims, but he's also been a source of considerable discomfort to large segments of New York's Jewish community for many years. An Orthodox woman who attended Marc Schneier's services calls his behavior and abuse of power. A lot of women admire and look up to rabbis because there are no female rabbis in Orthodox Judaism. It's horrible for a rabbi to abuse that trust. 2011, Tablet Magazine profiled Marc Schneier not long after his 4th marriage fell apart, and grainy photos of him on vacation with his new girlfriend appeared in the New York Daily News. Hoffman, the author, wondered whether the still popular Marc Schneier at that point had been markedly absent from Newsweek's ranking of the top 50 most influential rabbis in America, was even capable of getting himself into the kind of trouble that could tank his career for good. It is hard to imagine what kind of scandal would induce the rabbi's wealthy backers to withdraw their support from a man who seems like an odd fit as a communal role model and leader of a religious institution. Not much has changed. According to this New York Post report, morality or the lack thereof wasn't a big concern for many synagogue goers. The congregation was out to party. They come for the 3 F's: fun, food, and effing. says Esther Mueller, a Columbus Circle resident who works in real estate and has known Marc Schneier for decades. The weekly Saturday Kiddush, a celebratory meal after services, was legendary. 12 different kinds of herring for the 12 tribes. One congregant told the New York Post, King Solomon had 20 wives, 5 is nothing, and plenty of his congregants agree. You know the old expression that 60 million French can't be wrong, says one. 800 congregants on a Shabbos can't be wrong either. Okay, Doov, did you hear anything there you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, tying it back to what we're talking about with the Shapiro approach and the various understandings of Judaism. I was reading quite a bit of academic literature on modern Orthodoxy and quite a few interesting authors that I found. This guy Adam Ferzinger, looks like from Flatbush, who's now at Bar-Ilan in Jewish studies, and just this aspect of modern Orthodoxy, and say that modern Orthodoxy is not really an ideal, and no one in modern Orthodoxy actually thinks modern Orthodoxy is an ideal. It is a concession in order to get ahead in the world and maintain a standard. But your average, modern Orthodox person, so to say, at some point, like they're going to their claim to Orthodox is that they could walk into a more Orthodox synagogue. You could just grow your beard. I mean, Luke, you might be doing what you're doing, but once everything's settled down and you no longer have the concerns of, so to say, looking good with the goyim, you could grow your beard back and settle right back into Orthodoxy because the modern Orthodoxy was just a concession. And so from that kind of way of looking at it, yeah, like this rabbi represents the wealth and power that American Jews have achieved in America. He doesn't represent Judaism, and he collectively represents, so to say, God forbid, from some level, the concessions that these Jews made in order to get ahead. So when they went to the rabbi and these various people, and they were trying to maintain their connection to Hashem and Torah and mitzvahs, and they were trying to get ahead, they had a whole bunch of questions to a whole bunch of rabbis that gave them various answers about, what concessions can you make and still be within, the umbrella of Orthodoxy. And so at the end of the day, no one looks at his congregation as Orthodox, but just like Shapiro, you're going to have Galitzin, but the title is somewhat there because these people are all people that did their best to maintain their Orthodoxy and get ahead in America. But I don't think anybody, from the outside is looking at it that these people probably cared a lot more about getting ahead than, maintaining their Judaism. And so their rabbi is a mirror of the congregation, relatively. I was in Manhattan. I didn't spend much time on the Upper East Side, and there's really nothing there for me. Saying if you're doing business deals or you had money to invest or one of these institutes, but say that rabbi is a mirror of his congregation. In many ways, all rabbis are a mirror of their congregation. But at the same time, when you're talking about money, and you're in the Haredi circle, and maybe no one's divorced, and people generally have good, happy family lives, but they don't have the money and power. And so the grass is always greener on the other side. You want the money and power. It's more likely your rabbi is going to look like that than this more idealized rabbi that that people are probably going to be more comfortably going to.
Okay, so there are Orthodox rabbis who do outreach with blacks or with Muslims or with Christians, but overwhelmingly that's not much of a concern for Orthodox Jews, that these people are interesting because they're so exceptional. But overall, Orthodox Jews have very little interest in interfaith dialogue. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically forbidden. And I mean, I sent you that article, the 1956 conference of Agudas Yisrael, and 11 leading rabbis, including Rav Aaron Cutler and Rav Moshe Feinstein. And you probably look at the list, it's from the biggest names that separated from a previous, semi-Orthodox rabbinic group that was doing interfaith. And then it got further from there. And actually, I looked at 1963, and I was looking at this article publication of the Aguda. It was like Nathan Bullman, I guess a blessed memory, who was the Rosh Yeshiva at Orsamek when I was there, and went on. The goal was to recapture, what they said, the inevitable. All non-Orthodox Jews would lose, whatever conservative reform would just crumble, and they'd kind of capture back in through Kirov and Orthodox preachers. But this hardline approach of, not doing interfaith, not doing ecumenical councils, is largely, even God forbid, the Orthodox community is largely disliked in the public, in the media. If you're in New York, the news, the newspapers, almost like 95% of it is bad about Orthodox Jews. Very rarely do you see anything in the media that is positive about Orthodox Jews. And from that, so you could look at the approach, and if you're like, yeah, that's, it's kind of like a bunch of BS and stuff like that. But if you just refuse to participate, one thing, it creates a vacuum. So you have open orthodoxy. When the Recknicks came and spoke, the problem with open orthodoxy is that people want to know what Orthodox Jews think, but you can't really know what Orthodox Jews think, because like our theology is a little bit complicated. You can do business with us or deal with us at City Hall, but it's not so easy for us to just tell you what we think. So they're going to look to some rabbi that says, no, I'm Orthodox, and even if it's Marc Shapiro, and saying like, okay, Marc Shapiro might theologically or say he's Orthodox, but he's saying like, I don't think that man speaks on behalf of that community. So it creates a very interesting situation that LA is probably different than New York, where saying the Orthodox Jews are a voting bloc. In New York City, secular, some Jews have more money and power, but generally Orthodox Jews are the main power, and even in terms of money, finance, and just sheer mass numbers of hundreds of thousands, enough to affect elections. So, probably in LA, the size of the Orthodox community is much smaller in percentage. And I don't know about in LA, is the media publicity on Orthodox Jews generally like always bad?
Not sure. I don't see it that way, but I'm sure many people do. I mean, there are plenty of Orthodox Jews with a victim mentality in Los Angeles that, the whole system's rigged against us. Let me play a little bit more here from scholar Aaron W. Hughes and his book on Islamic studies.
Absolutely clear what we're doing. We're not here to adjudicate what is good Islam, what is bad Islam. We're here to show how various groups who invoke the term Islam struggle with one another and struggle with. So I'm really interested, probably because of my own contorted sense of identity. I'm always interested in how identity is constructed, maintained, formed, patrolled, etc. So this is what I try to do in the religious studies, in the Islamic religious studies classroom.
Now, you talk about this in the first chapter, or the first section, I should say, in relation to Muhammad. And you use several kind of books that are aimed at a kind of mix of popular, Muslim, non-Muslim, general readership, I guess would be a good way to phrase it.
Right.
So what do you see as kind of the characteristics of some of these post-9/11 histories of Muhammad or biographies of Muhammad, or however you want to describe it?
Sure. Well, I think the majority of them fib. And that's because, as any scholar of early Islam will tell you, we know next to nothing about the Prophet Muhammad. All we have are the reminiscences of later generations. And it bothers me that the books of which I'm critical in that chapter are all written by believing Muslims who are trying to say that we can accurately access the historical Muhammad when they know that we can't. So I try to ask the question, well, I try to contextualize these sources, these contemporary books as well. They're doing the exact same thing that the earliest Muslims were doing. And that is, they're trying to create Muhammad in their own images. So rather than read these works as secondary sources, which in many ways is the way the authors present them, I chose to read them as primary sources. That is, as
right. So he's making the point that we have no contemporary accounts of Muhammad, that everything we know about him comes from sources that were much later than his actual life. The sources that we rely on to know anything about Muhammad are at least 200 years after he died. Same with the New Testament. The sources that we rely upon come, probably the earliest ones the Gospels were written, say, 40 years after Jesus died. So how reliable are they? To the believer, these works are works of God, and to the non-believer, they treat these works with a great deal of skepticism. Was there anything you heard there that you'd like to comment on, Dooovid?
Yeah, I actually really like this guy, Hughes. I don't like him, but I've been enlightened from reading 2 of his books now, and now hearing him, and yeah, it's just a question of what does it mean to you? So within yeshiva and orthodoxy, it's more the lifestyle. We're learning it to do it. We're learning it because largely we believe. In an academic house, you really have to have the axiom that the religion is basically false. And looking Muhammad and comparing Judeo studies, or even recent things like the Holocaust. The way Jews look from a religion at the Holocaust versus what the historical, what it means to history and Jewish theology, and kind of like a I want to call Shapiro like an apologist, but it's not the correct term. But you're saying like these Muslims are coming in and to universities, like we haven't been in your university, but let me inform you that our religion is in fact true, and all of your things that are worthwhile, we're going to be able to correspond. And then at some point they're like, oh man, like I'm not going to convert all these guys to Islam. And if it was a Jewish approach, like I'm going to march right into Jewish studies and get the pulpit, and I'm going to say the Rebbe is Messiah, fall in line, and it's not going to work probably that well. And then you get into apologetics where it's just kind of like, okay, we're not that bad though. Like we believe in kind of this backward, messed up stuff, but that was what got us here today. And now, we've reformed our beliefs that in a way that's more, conducive to a harmonious society of different peoples versus the person, it's going to be like, yeah, I'm doing academic journals and you could, trust that I'm being, factual with everything I'm telling you and not bending the truth. But yes, deep down in my heart, I still believe Messiah is going to come and like we're going to win. And so it's a real difficult dynamic. Like who's in academic studies, and probably why I like Hughes. Like I said, like probably why I like Luke. I enjoy Jewish history and Jewish studies from non-Jews better than Jews because the bias is less. And even Dooovid, who tries my best to limit my bias, like still like I'm a Jew, I'm biased. And so Islamic studies, like some of the better books I have on Islamic studies were written by people critical of Islam. And that's the same way like anti-Semitic literature, because in the academic halls you're not really going to find book critical on Judaism, but maybe like God forbid, like anti-Semitic literature, it's books that are critical on Judaism. And from a Judeo scholarship point of view, like shouldn't that be what we're doing?
And I'm looking at the chat. There's a question: who's a greater villain in Judaism, Jesus or Muhammad? And my response is almost no attention is paid in the Jewish tradition to either. The rabbis have very little concern about either Jesus or Muhammad, and I would say that 99% of Jews are indifferent. They could not care less about either Jesus or Muhammad. Rabbis don't pay much attention to either of these characters. Would you agree, Dooovid?
Yeah, but there obviously is going to be rabbis who specialize in, have studied these things to make rulings that are related, that might be, especially in Israel. So your average rabbi and your average Jew won't study these things and won't have any benefit. But because a sizable amount of people will have practical necessity in dealing with these people, there are rabbis that specialize in this stuff and would be authoritative relatively within orthodoxy. But like as said, like your average person, it doesn't matter. If you're going into business and it's like, who should I be partners with? Can I be partners with this guy? Can I buy this building in this neighborhood or that neighborhood? Or your practical decision for the community. If there's like a Catholic school right next to their synagogue. But besides that, yeah, there's no benefit for Jews to even think about it. Let alone study it if it's not practical to their day-to-day experience. Like it basically is only going to lead to problems, God forbid.
So one friend of mine, a non-Jew, says, what is Orthodox Jewish morality other than self-serving cynicism? So obviously I'm going to disagree with that as someone who converted to Orthodox Judaism, but there's nothing inherently cynical about being self-serving. You should be self-serving. But every individual should put his own interests most of the time first. Now, when he becomes a parent, there should be plenty of times when he puts his children's interest ahead of his own. But there's nothing cynical about self-interest. Self-interest is appropriate. Now, what about morality for a group, such as Orthodox Jews? You want a group morality that puts the best interests of your group first. I can't imagine developing a group morality that does not put your group's best interests first. So Orthodox Jewish morality is a way of life that aims at sustaining and elevating the Jewish people. But Dooovid, what's your reaction to this comment here by a non-Jew? What is Orthodox Jewish morality other than self-serving cynicism?
Yeah, but that's, God forbid, completely inaccurate, because you're saying that there is a hardcore ethic about what is allowed, what isn't, what is beyond the line of a reasonable course of action, and what isn't. So if you're, problematic in the sense we have a dual morality system that has a way that we deal with our fellow Jews versus the way we deal with, Goyim, so to say, but it's not intrinsically self-serving. You can't just, the dealings with Goyim are not, God forbid, designed to just, whatever self-serving, that's what you could do. There's hard lines of what is honest, what is allowed, and what isn't allowed. So I would completely, disagree. And then, it's like, I think I heard a rabbi in Israel say, like, when you're on the airplanes, that, first secure the air mask for yourself before helping out. And you have to help yourself to help out others. And it's just a fact, from like, why Jews make good Republicans. Like, talk is cheap. They tell people like who have Republican leanings, like first become rich, then you can become a Jewish Republican. But like, as you're not going to get very far as a poor Jewish Republican. But in the sense that like there's so many statements in the Torah that say the purpose of Judaism is to do. I put in the chat earlier those ones from Ethics of the Father. The person whose deeds, good deeds outdo his wisdom will last, but his wisdom outdoes his good deeds. His wisdom won't last. And like we mentioned, the guys who learn, anyone who learns in Koilel also knows that there's this whole long list of things that supersede learning Torah, and a lot of that includes like familial, duties. And so, if you're a believer, you say like, yeah, it's a really good system and it just works out good. And even if we have struggles in our belief, you could still be largely avowed to the system within, a certain exception, like me and Luke stream and talk about this stuff. And we're not going to get any praise in the community for doing this, but it's not with, as long as we keep Sabbath and, within the accepted boundaries. So it is a different view of truth. And that's what, for a few weeks now, Doov has largely been making the concession that I would say is consistent from the New Testament to Kant to Richard Spencer and Greg Johnson, is that, yes, as Jews, we have an instrumental view towards truth. And I think Luke would agree, most Jews aren't going to make that concession. They're going to fight on that. But when I say we have an instrumental view towards truth, that does not mean that we're self-serving and have no ethics.
Right. So my friend says that the central maxim for Orthodox Jews is what is good for me is good. Well, I think that should be the central maxim for everybody. Not 100% of the time, but probably 80 to 90% of the time, you should look out for what is good for you. That's not the only consideration, but there's nothing wrong with self-interest. If you don't have a substantial amount of self-interest, you're not going to do very well in life and very likely become a burden to other people. So my friend, non-Jewish friend, says it's a mitzvah to break the rules. No, all Jewish values and all Jewish rules occur in a context. So the context determines which rule is primary. For example, there have been occasions on Yom Kippur when the rabbis have ruled that Jews should eat on Yom Kippur to keep up their strength to deal with, say, some infection that is going around. So it's not so much that it's a breaking of the rules to not eat, it's putting a primacy on the rule that you should live. So any thoughts, Dooovid?
Yeah, it was kind of what I was saying, like when I was explaining why I smoked weed yesterday. It's like so even the person I was driving was like, you can't smoke weed. But it's like, no, my rabbi, I mean, he maybe didn't even know what it was. But, my rabbi or the people I spoke with knew my circumstances. Like, you have to do what's best for yourself. And generally, what's best for people is absolutely not smoking marijuana. There's no way any rabbi in Orthodox community is going to recommend, the masses start smoking marijuana. But given my circumstances, you got to do what's best for yourself. And that's why I was saying why this topic on heresy, it's like, Marc Shapiro, he's a heretic, God forbid, or anybody, just using that language, because generally you have to do what's best. We're supposed to live by Torah, not die by Torah, but there is a hard line, the three rules generally, and if you want to say it over, you can, but one of those is possibly going to include at least acting on heresy. So you're going to make that red line where, like, yeah, generally you got to do what you got to do to get ahead and live by Torah. But there are these hard lines where at some point you have to be willing to give up your life for beliefs to be a Jew.
Now, I titled this stream, What is a Way of Life That Works? Do you think that there are generalizable principles for a way of life that works? Do you think there are some objective statements of ways of life that generally work? Or do you think this is entirely subjective, fatuous, and self-serving?
Well, that's why I mentioned in Brooklyn, and a guy knew, a very Hasidic guy who had the strength of dealing with in his community, where obviously there were tens of thousands, and he described Judaism like the first thing you need to know about Judaism is there's always a loophole, because generally there is always a loophole, and so we start explaining things, and then all of a sudden we say something that's the opposite, and then it's all of a sudden pilpul, because you have to understand that there's various factors. It's a hard rule, except if it's taken away from your livelihood or your health or security, and then there may be exceptions. So like these points, it could become complicated because you told me this and then you told me that, and then it's like, well, I told you this, but like that was assuming that my health and security and livelihood was all secure. But if that's not the case, then the rule might change. And I think most goyim, most educated people, like look and see like, yeah, truth has to work that way, because you can't have these hard rules, but you can't just have lawlessness. Like obviously Orthodox Jews, we're known for our rules, we're known for our traditions, we're known, like we don't budge. Like at the end of the like if you're sick or there's some issue, Sabbath, there could be exceptions. I mean the Shapiro video, like even 12 steps on Sabbath. But like if things are going good, the exceptions go away. And that's why I mean like modern Orthodoxy versus Orthodoxy, that in theory, modern Orthodoxy it's not, it's a concession that we're making because we're not in a perfect circumstance. And even most modern Orthodox people would say in a better circumstance. I'm not saying that modern Orthodoxy is the best form of Judaism. I'm just saying it's the best form of Judaism for the current circumstance.
Okay, so I have certain principles that I believe make for a life that works. And principle number one is that you are aware of how you spend your time, that you don't lose track of time to such a significant degree that you're compromising what you stand for, that you're not taking care of your most important responsibilities, that you're not diluting your efforts, that you're not throwing away your time, your talents. And so a life that works, you track your time, you're aware of your time, you plan how you spend your time, and you use your time to further your goals and to meet your responsibilities. And the same thing with money. You track how much you earn, you track how you spend, and you take care of these matters. So if you track your earning, your spending, and how you use your time, to me, these are characteristics of a life that works. If you don't track your spending, if you don't track your earning, if you're not planning how you spend your time, if you're not staying on top of how you're spending your time, if you're not staying on top of your bank balance, your credit card balance, with what your bills are, if you're not on top of all these things, you have a life that doesn't work. Any thoughts, Dooovid?
It's funny because I knew a lot of people who became Hare Krishnas, and I told them, what from their sources would be, if you're doing it right, it should be making your life better. It should be making your relationships with your friends and parents and colleagues better. And actually, a lot of them it does, because a lot of people that switch like that have very difficult relations with their parents, and through becoming Hindu, actually could have better relationships with their family. And Judaism, like if you're becoming a Baal Tshuva or trying to become more Orthodox, there's going to be certain concessions, but generally, it should make our life better. And there's hundreds and hundreds of general rules, that are just generally understood to be true. But like I said, there's always a loophole. There's always an exception. And a lot of the truisms in the Talmud, like Luke said, wasting time is considered a sin. It's not just like you're from the perspective of Luke saying it's a good way to live your life. Orthodox Judaism has it so much that theologically we should be worried that oh man, I'm going to go to hell because I wasted time. It was like the story of the Chafetz Chaim who supposedly on Yom Kippur calculated that he needs to repent because he wasted, and it was 10 minutes the whole year or something, and calculated that he spends less time wearing slip-on shoes than tie shoes, or different things that could be what makes saints who exhibited these traits to extreme, but are general things like davening and discipline. And a lot of Jews say the lifestyle, even if you fall out of the belief pattern, it's I don't think God cares if I go to shul every day and put on tefillin and say these mantras again and again, that you still say the lifestyle keeps me disciplined and it keeps me successful. And then I always say Church of Entropy, I was saying measure karma like money. And in Orthodox Judaism, generally how good you're doing is measured by how well your family's doing, even more so than how much money you're making. But how much money it's how are you, why me and Luke, God forbid, we're old bachelors, but in general Orthodox community, your success is almost completely measured by your family and how well your kids are doing, and how well you're doing in business. And although we praise learning Torah is the highest of all ideals, Judaism praises the intellectual, maybe more than most known traditions. We're famous for education, but it's always designed practical. Measure your success by practical success. Judaism in general, you're not doing it right if it's not making your life more successful.
Right. So my friend says, look, your whole thing on a life that works, your approach is fatuous. You believe that if people say have a good reputation and get along with other people and are say widely respected and appear calm and in control of their emotions and in control of their life, that that means that they have an approach to life that works. And I would say in 95% of situations, yes, that is a life that works. If you are known and you are liked and you are popular and you are respected in your community by people who know you well, you very likely have an approach to life that works. A good name is very important in Judaism and in most ways of life. It doesn't mean that it's 100% accurate, but it is a pretty good indication that if somebody is liked, if he is known and he is liked and he is respected, that is a very strong indication that in overwhelming likelihood that they do have a way of life that works. Any thoughts, Dooovid?
Yeah, so I think when it comes down to the business things we've been talking about, so it's you're very successful landlord or mortgage broker or life insurance salesman that made concessions on a few things of orthodoxy. Okay, and usually within Haredi, they definitely want to get people married and with children before they even start thinking about this, because generally, they wouldn't necessarily phrase it in those terms, although some of the rabbis did actually phrase it in those terms. Was you marry the kids off at 18, 19, 17 and have them kids first, and that way when they come across these ideas, it's too late. It's largely too late, because then you already have your kids and you already have the force of wanting your kid to be maintained in good standing in the Jewish community. And that if you go too far out of the boundaries of what's acceptable, you're not going to be able to raise your kids in good standing there. So say Orthodox, I'm in good standing among the official Jews. And like my kids are in the official Jewish institutions, and so on and so on. And so it's communal. That's why there's a lot of talking to rabbis and mentorship. And a lot of times, like let's say the people, they didn't like go to university and read a whole bunch of books and get cultured. They were an exceptional mortgage broker or life insurance salesman, and largely what motivated their interest in larger society is what let them close more deals. Like so to say, the guy who introduced Jared Kushner to Ivanka Trump did it so that he could make money. He did it so that he could make money on a mortgage deal. And you're just like, oh man, if I could get these two people together and buy a building, like I'll get a good commission on a mortgage. And but the mindset of a life that works, what do you need to know? What are you better off just not thinking about what's going to cause me to get off track? And like I love, me and Luke were talking up a storm, but you're saying like, what are we going to do to get on track to build up a Jewish family?
Okay, next characteristic of a life that works is that you are open to new ideas. It doesn't mean that you take every idea that comes along, but you don't have an automatic idea deflection shield up. So Dooovid and I talk before shows, between shows, maybe even during shows, and I am open to Doovid's suggestions, and he is open to my suggestions. So to me, Dooovid, this is an important characteristic of a life that works, is that you're open to ideas, new ideas, and suggestions from other people.
Definitely. But I mean, because me and Luke have kind of been like online cavrusas, like it's streaming, but the nature where me and Luke met, it was kind of always like a cavrusa type Jewish learning relationship, which I think is a different dynamic. Like if me and Luke met, in the city streets in terms of a business deal, the nature of the interaction might force it to be different. But like in any circumstances, certainly in learning and trying to perfect ideas, listening is key. But in all circumstances and all dealings, just being able to listen, being able to take in new information, and what I would say, being able to live with dissonance, even just saying, okay, this person said something that doesn't correspond with the way I see the world, and just, okay, I'll sit with it. This like Elu Velu, this person says this, and if I think about it too much, it's going to cause me dissonance. So just let it sit there and like, okay, there's a person who thinks like that. Is it really going to help me in my life working to try to figure out why this person sees things in a way that's so contradictory to the way I see it, or is it going to make my life work less to divert a whole bunch of time in trying to understand these divergent views?
Right. So next characteristic of a life that works is that you are not compelled to persuade people that you're something. I mean, people who are trying to manipulate you into believing that you're something that you're not, they're absolutely exhausting. Right? People who want you to believe that they're more powerful, more successful, more intelligent than they really are. It's highly tiring to be around these people who are trying to prove something to you in a compulsive, repetitive way. It's very tiring to be around someone. So this compulsive need to prove is an example of an approach that life that doesn't work, as opposed to when you're interacting with someone who is at peace with who they are and who isn't trying to pretend to be something that they're not. To me, being at peace with who you are and being relatively transparent about who you are, to me, this is an important symptom of a life that works. Any thoughts, Dooovid?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Church of Entropy is still around, but you kind of need to be enlightened to know who you are. So I agree in 100%, but it's not that easy for a person to just know like who I am, and then to accurately represent themselves. And that's where dissonance comes in, because who I think I am doesn't necessarily match who I am, and most people tend to perceive themselves in their best version, or they see themselves who they think they're going to become in a future better way, and would like to be perceived as this person who is about to do something great. And but 100% what Luke's saying. And even in streaming, it's like you could get a little bit of an ego when life works. You get a real boost, saying like, if you got married and you had kids and you had another kid, that's a real thing that you don't need to pretend like, if you have kids, you don't need to pretend that you have kids. If you have money, you don't need to pretend that you have money. And the valuable things, like, you could do a lot with money. And if you have it, you could do those things. And just like streaming, like 25 viewers, you have 25 viewers, like that's something people, like you could use that. If it was 100 viewers, there's a tangible amount to what you've achieved, to what that you could do with that power. So to say that when you portray yourself as fake, it almost always collapses. And God forbid, probably what Luke was talking about the other day in terms of San Bernardino Valley, and was saying like, thank God, like not everybody suffers lust. People have different tests, and not everybody suffers lust as badly as their fellow man. Some people are naturally low testosterone, but I think a lot of this, like portraying yourself as someone you're not, is largely probably related to promiscuity and like trying to trick women in like Roosh, and even in business dealings, like almost all the people that like fake it till you make it, pretend like you're like a millionaire mortgage broker when you never closed a deal, it like basically never works. That the fake it till you make it to some aspect has some truth to it, but like no, I mean you can't cheat and fool people and make them think that you have competence that you don't. It basically always backfires.
I like the idea by this Japanese lady, Marie Kondo, that you should only keep the things that make you happy, that spark joy. So I think in addition to tracking your income and tracking your spending and tracking how you spend your time, you should also be aware of what you have, your possessions, and you should not allow stuff to build up, right? If you've got a whole bunch of junk that you've got hidden behind, say, a closet, or hidden behind a door, or you just keep, pushing junk into the garage, that's going to be a burden on you. And if, on the other hand, you stay organized, you stay clean, and you really only keep the things and keep the people in your life that bring you joy. For example, on this live stream, I've consistently only allowed people onto this live stream who bring me joy. That if someone's not bringing me joy, I stop sending them invites. They stop coming on this show. So to me, this is an important characteristic of a life that works. Generally speaking, you only keep the people and the possessions in your life that bring you joy, and you track them, and you don't allow junk to build up, either in the form of junky people or in the form of junky possessions. Any thoughts, Dooovid?
Yeah, I think I pushed back to you on the past on this, and I say yes, but usually the best things in life come from hard work and from suffering. And when you want expertise, you're probably not going to gain expertise by doing what makes you happy, because there's going to be a certain amount of hard work, and it's going to be unenjoyable. So if you're an adult man and you're your own man, been through school and got your degrees or whatever, and you don't want to go back into the classroom, but sometimes it is like that. And when you want to really accomplish, you got to learn from the best, and you might if you want to study, Dooovid doesn't have a natural affinity towards Marc Shapiro, but say, okay, if Dooovid really wants to learn the Rambam, I'll study and learn from Marc Shapiro if it could be demonstrated that Marc Shapiro has a better understanding of the Rambam, even if initially it doesn't bring me joy. And I remember in yeshiva, that was always driven in people, like, because studying Talmud, a lot of the stuff is just like, how possibly could this stuff ever benefit me? Like, I was in yeshiva for months. We learned Yevamos and Nedorim, like the laws of Levirate marriages and like vows. So like months and months, like, studying Talmud in Jerusalem about Levirate marriages. But like the rabbi is saying, like, trust the plan, that the suffering of breaking your mind to understand this will pay off in the long term. So I think I think Luke probably agrees with what I said, but I want to at least give that pushback.
Yeah, and I think another symptom of a life that works is that, generally speaking, you're able to get along with other people. So for many people, drama is their substitute for accomplishment, that their life is constant drama. And if you have those people in your life, they're going to drag you down and they're going to exhaust you. So some people are just uncomfortable with stability. They suffer from stability boredom, and they have to create unnecessary conflict with other people. So you want to be around people who are at ease with getting along, who are at ease with stability and at ease with structure. And so if you have these dramatic people in your life, it's going to take an enormous toll. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my success largely, avoiding conflict, and like I had to almost move to Hinduism, because like Hinduism is probably more, at least for Western Jewish practitioner, easier to avoid conflict than Judaism. And even kind of why I fell out of Orthodox circles once I started going to university, and then I got involved in things like interfaith and interdenominational things. It became very difficult for me to go to Orthodox places, politically, because the tendencies of what I was doing was pushing me to the left, as where the Orthodox places were very to the right. And it's very hard to avoid conflict. There's an art to avoiding conflict. Some people are good at being in extremely high conflict situations and avoiding it. And some people are, you got to know your limits. So if I know that certain places or people or conversations are likely to bring me conflict, to say like conflict is a bad thing, anger is a bad character trait, and it pays to avoid situations that bring out the worst in me. I say that streaming to people, and like Gandalf or Brundlefly, or they were good streamers, but they were famous largely for when they publicly had the worst brought out in them. And there's the most famous people are people who do violence, and like in terms of viewership, people like fights and sports. But for like health, happy, good relations and family, generally, if you could go to sleep at night saying, I don't have a problem with anybody, and I don't know if Luke says the prayer, I'm sure it's in his prayer book before Kriya Shema, saying Shema Yisrael before we go to sleep. The prayer in the prayer book actually says that we're supposed to forgive everybody who wronged us, and basically go to sleep conflict free.
Yeah, and conflict is exhausting, and negotiating is exhausting. It's much more efficient. It's just much easier to solve things according to a dominance hierarchy. So, for example, if I'm going on Doovid's show, I accept that Doov sets the rules for that show. If I'm going on JF Garapi's show, I accept that JF sets the rules for that show, and I respond accordingly. If someone comes on my show, they need to accept that I make the rules for my show. If Doov came into a lot of money and he wanted to employ me to do something, I would need to accept that no matter that Doov and I have been friends on and off for years, that in this particular situation, Doov would be my employer and I would be his employee. And in this situation, I would be subordinate to what Doov wants. Just as if I employed Doov for a task, I would need Doov to accept that he needs to subordinate himself to this task that I'm going to pay him for. So rather than having conflict and rather than going through arduous negotiation, I think it's much simpler to simply abide by the dominance hierarchy. And it's not like any of us are permanently dominant and none of us are permanently subordinate. It's just in different roles in our lives. Sometimes we're going to be dominant in a particular interaction. Sometimes we're going to be subordinate. Sometimes we're going to be the employer. Sometimes we're going to be the employee. Sometimes we're going to be the host. And sometimes we're going to be the guest. And so we need to stay in our lane, have an accurate sense of our own relative importance in an interaction, and simply allow the dominance hierarchy to determine within our own ethical boundaries, determine where there's a conflict. Okay, if it's a conflict with an employer, then the employer should decide. If it's a conflict with an employee, then the employee needs to defer to the employer. If it's a conflict with a host and you want to be the host place, then you need to defer to the host. Any thoughts on allowing the dominance hierarchy to settle conflicts, Dovid?
Yeah, definitely. I've basically phrased what you're saying on Week in Review. I say Doov is good at following rules and functioning in high rule-based systems. Even though, like, I'm an eccentric, so to say, and like I said, if I judge Claire favorably, like, maybe like the Chinese people I went to university with, that I work with, he's like, this is a competent person. If I asked him about his beliefs, he'd probably tell me something crazy. But within the rules that we function, he did his job. We got a good grade. We closed the deal. We made the money. And most relations have a certain amount of rules. Like basically all relations have a certain amount of rules. Like, me and Luke are talking. So, it's his channel or my channel. So his channel, I'm following his rules. If we were in, if it was my house or his house, if he was in my house, like I would expect him to follow my rules. And if I was in his house, I would expect to follow his rules. And like synagogues, like, I pray with the modern Orthodox, I'm not necessarily going to change my opinions because I'm praying with them, but I follow their rules. I'm not a troublemaker. I'm basically never a troublemaker anywhere I go. Like I try to scout out the rules and largely abide by it, social distance, even when I disagree 100%. And then there's an art to knowing kind of how much could you bend the rules. So like in New York, like you could smoke weed and not really get in trouble. Like cocaine, God forbid, that was a big risk. But like generally, like a little bit of marijuana, even in Hasidic circles, wasn't a big deal. Like, okay, it's like technically illegal, and maybe you shouldn't blast it around. But there's a certain understanding how much can you stretch the rules. Like on your taxes, on Amazon, eBay, user fees, or in like speeding is the example. Like I almost always speed, but I don't egregiously speed. I usually speed like exactly 4 miles or 9 miles over the speed limit, unless traffic. If traffic is booking, I'll go with traffic. But usually, like I meticulously go exactly 9 miles over the speed limit, and things like that. But yeah, I would agree 100%. Most of my success is largely because I follow rules, and like thank God I'm I've been in health. Like I haven't suffered poverty or a lot of things, and basically because I follow rules, and even if they seem stupid, generally if I could follow them and saying like I'm probably going to be better off for doing it. Social distancing, I went to the temple, saying it was like you could talk to me from a few feet away. Like me and Luke were at synagogue, and either me or him, pulled into 5 or 6 feet. It's like, no, like you have your mask on, you're 10 feet away. I hear you fine. You don't actually have to get closer. And it's like, well, why not function within these rules? Like maybe it's dumb, maybe it's okay, but and probably Luke also, you're saying like if you're defining of how were you able to navigate these very difficult situations, because you could assess the situation and follow rules.
Great. So most of my thinking on this discussion of life that works comes from my experience with 12-step programs, and 12-step programs were in large part inspired by the philosopher William James, in particular his book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, and also by the psychologist Carl Jung. So I want to play a little bit more from the Jewish scholar Aaron W. Hughes.
Nothing different than what the compilers of the Sirat Rasulullah were doing in the 200 years or so after the death of Muhammad. So that's what I'm critical of, is that and I think one of them even says that the reader can rest assured that the Muhammad presented here will be the authentic Muhammad. Whenever the term authentic is used, it always makes me nervous. Whenever I go into an authentic Italian restaurant outside of Italy, I never know. I would usually avoid such a restaurant. And these authors also tell us that they've read all the sources, but they never tell us that those sources are extremely problematic. So what I try to do in that chapter is to say, well, wait a minute, you're trying to position yourself in such a way that you're an authority about the historical Muhammad, when in fact we know nothing about the historical Muhammad. But essentially what you're trying to do is create a Muhammad that reflects your sensibilities. So we see the construction of a liberal Muhammad, a Muhammad who is a feminist, a Muhammad who is big on the environment, and a Muhammad who is I can't remember some of the other examples I give. And I'm just trying to say, well, whoa, let's step back here and really see what's going on in these texts. And I'm critical of such books. In fact, I try to juxtapose them against some other books, books by David Powers, who is a much more skeptical historian, or someone like Stephen Shoemaker, who is, again, another more skeptical historian. And I'm not trying to...
So I sent Aaron Hughes an email this week, and he sent me very nice replies. So he's a mensch to take the time to respond.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do in that chapter, is trying to say, well, let's go back to I'm going to use that horrible name. Let's go back to some of the old Orientalist traditions. So the questions I'm asking, or the questions that Powers asking, the questions that Shoemaker is asking, are questions that were asked 150 years ago. But as I try to argue in both Situated Islam and Theorizing Islam, Edward Said in his Orientalism largely succeeded in saying that all those types of studies that look at historical critical sources, or look at historical sources critically, are somehow part of a plot to undermine Islam.
Now,
yeah, you hear this from feminists and lefties and wackos that any kind of objective study of the truth, or adherence to facts, or adherence to logic, that somehow it's some kind of like white supremacy. Any thoughts, Dooovid, on anything you've heard the last few minutes?
Yeah, it's funny because I took the approach of basically Freemasonry, where I'm largely pro Freemasonry, even though I'm not a member of any lodge, or I never took any oaths, as a method to do this critical academic interfaith study, but be a believer at the same time. Because in the academic realm, it's pretty hard to be a believer, but that's probably why historically Jews tiered towards Freemasonry was because it was a system that allowed us to be like, this is what I believe and it's true, and it's possible that this is what you believe and it's also true. And so Freemasonry somewhat allowed for what's probably just not possible, from an academic approach, to say they both can't be true. Either there is a historical Muhammad and he did this or that, or it's a legend of someone who didn't exist. And so in a Masonic kind of great personalities, maybe God is behind all these people type thing. It's interesting, and that's what I said. The academic circles, who's their audience, and usually their audience is people who are interested in culture, or people who are interested in belief from either inside, Jews who read Judeo studies because they're interested in how we're perceived, or Jews who read Islamic studies because we're concerned about Israel and our relation with the countries in the Middle East, and we know they're Islamic, versus a person who's they're studying Islam because they want to convert, or usually in university where it's related to multiculturalism. So then it's to portray, the purpose of the Islamic professor largely comes to portray Islam in a positive light. So all of a sudden you have Islamic professors that are, the feminist Muhammad, and it was interesting to read Aaron. I had never thought about it in that manner, but it's kind of these Islamic scholars are kind of like apologists who are trying to do what's best for the Muslim community in making these concessions. And I've been saying it for years right now. It's every Islam, because they're a Democrat, it's Orthodox Jews, we're on the left. And our coalition includes homosexuals like Jakey Jake, the very first argument I had on the Luke Ford show. And so, Muslims, even though, God forbid, ISIS is, Iran, they're executing homosexuals in the West. The Islamic studies have shifted the narrative so much that, Muslims are praised in the West for their tolerance of homosexuals. And that happened through Islamic studies, probably.
Yeah. Okay, I've been reading a terrific book by Stephen Pressfield. It's called The War of Art, Break Through the Blocks and Win Your Inner Creative Battles. Let me just read some excerpts. Most of us have two lives. There's the life we live and the unlived life within us. Between the two stands resistance. Late at night, have you experienced a vision of the person you might become, the work you could accomplish, the realized being you were meant to be? You're a writer who doesn't write, a painter who doesn't paint, an entrepreneur who never starts a venture. Then you know what resistance is. Resistance is the most toxic force on the planet. It is the root of more unhappiness than poverty, disease, and erectile dysfunction. To yield to resistance deforms our spirit. It stunts us and makes us less than we are. and are born to be. If you believe in God, you must declare resistance evil, for it prevents us from achieving the life God intended when he endowed each of us with his own unique genius. Genius is a Latin word. The Romans used it to denote an inner spirit, holy and inviolable, which watches over us and guides us to our calling. A writer writes with his genius. An artist paints with hers. Everyone who creates operates from this sacred center. It is our soul seat, the vessel that holds our being in potential, our star's beacon and Polaris. How many of us have become drunks and drug addicts, developed tumors and neuroses, succumbed to painkillers, gossip, and compulsive cell phone use simply because we don't do that thing that our hearts, our inner genius, is calling us to do? Often couples or close friends, even entire families, will enter into tacit compacts whereby each individual pledges unconsciously to remain mired in the same slough in which she and all her cronies have become so comfortable. The awakening artist must be ruthless, not only with herself but with others. Once you make your break, you can't turn around for your buddy who catches his trouser leg on the barbed wire. We get ourselves in trouble because it is a cheap way to get attention. Trouble is a faux form of fame. It is easier to get busted in the bedroom with the faculty chairman's wife than it is to finish that dissertation on the metaphysics of Motley in the novellas of Joseph Conrad. Ill health is a form of trouble, as are alcoholism and drug addiction, proneness to accidents, all neurosis, including compulsive screwing up, and such seemingly benign foibles as jealousy, chronic lateness, and the blasting of rap music. Anything that draws attention to ourselves through pain-free or artificial means is a manifestation of resistance. Cruelty to others is a form of resistance, as is the willing endurance of cruelty from others. The working artist will not tolerate trouble in his life because he knows trouble prevents him from doing his work. The working artist banishes from his world all sources of trouble. He harnesses the urge for trouble and he transforms it into his work. Anything there you want to comment on, Dooovid?
Yeah, I'm not such an artist or much for poetry, so I'm more scientific. I'd say like generally it's probably not a good idea to fantasize. I was thinking in Orthodox Judaism, there might be two things where people kind of believe in supernatural fantasies, and that's largely about getting rich, like a Fiddler on the Roof, if I were a rich man, and the downfall of our anti-Semitic foes, where there's something like maybe something miraculous could happen, and I could be a millionaire, and what I would do with all that money, and then also like an expectation that maybe something miraculous would happen, and my foes will have a downfall. Like Jewish theology has these terms like Shtadlan, which is like effort, and you have to make like a vessel for God to bless us. And but I mean Judaism, like no, you have to do the work. And saying like our successful businessmen or the people who succeeded, it's almost always, or say basically always, because they worked really hard at it, and they followed best practices, and got advice, and so it's good to have self-confidence. It's good to have desire. There's an expression in the sages, "Ein davar omed lifnei ratzon," that nothing could stand in the way of a desire. And the Kabbalists, you have a understanding of theology, but like it's good to have a burning desire, but the burning desire can't turn into fantasy, and the person has to recognize that there's methods for things to happen and come true, and almost all those methods are hard work. And this thing I said in Avos, the statement that the mission in Avos, I have to look up the exact words, but basically what makes a life that works is a person who loves work. The best secret to a life of success is to love work.
Right, and so the fourth commandment doesn't just say you should rest on the Sabbath day, it also says you should work 6 days a week. Back to Stephen Pressfield, creating a soap opera in our lives is a symptom of resistance. Why put in years of work designing a new software interface when you can get just as much attention by bringing home a boyfriend with a prison record? Doctors estimate that up to 80% of their business is non-health related. People aren't sick, they are self-dramatizing. The acquisition of a condition lends significance to one's existence. An illness, a cross to bear. Some people go from condition to condition. They cure one and another pops up to take its place. The condition becomes a work of art in itself, a shadow version of the real creative act the victim is avoiding by expending so much care cultivating his condition. A victim act is a form of passive aggression. It seeks to achieve gratification not by honest work or a contribution made out of one's experience or insight or love, but by the manipulation of others through silent and not so silent threat. The victim compels others to come to his rescue or to behave as he wishes by holding them hostage to the prospect of his own further illness, meltdown, mental dissolution, or simply by threatening to make their lives so miserable that they do what he wants. Human being isn't wired to function as an individual. We are wired tribally to act as part of a group. Our psyches are programmed by millions of years of hunter-gatherer evolution. We know what the clan is. We know how to fit into the band and the tribe. What we don't know is how to be alone. What exactly is this inner despair that leads to extremism? It is the despair of freedom, the dislocation and emasculation experienced by the individual cut free from the familiar and the comforting structures of the tribe, the clan, the village, and the family. So, Dooovid, I think when many Jews leave Orthodox Judaism, they are incredibly disoriented. Anything you heard you want to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, within Hasidism, there's semi like Hinduism. I don't know if anyone ever did it to you, like like a rabbi or like a like who are you, like who am I? And it's funny. I think at YU, Yeshiva University, like that's one of their things. Like why you? Like I mean, YU stands for Yeshiva University, but it's like why you? Why is it you? And so there's a reflection of say, who am I? What's my real identity? And obviously, Luke, in your research and talking with the alt-right and these various nationalism and analyzing all these topics that semi-center around identity, and like me and Jennifer approach it more from enlightenment, but enlightenment in non-spiritual terms could possibly be a question of identity, and it's a very important issue. And just your last comment about people who leave Orthodox Judaism, it's a very difficult question of identity. Like, what's their identity now? And a large portion of them, I mean, God forbid, have a hard time recouping some sort of identity. What does it mean to be an Orthodox Jew that's no longer Orthodox? How do they present themselves to the public, in the family? How do they formulate a new identity? Or if it's just going to be like a LARP where say it's true, like this is my new identity, I'm sticking with it. So so it's just like I'm an Orthodox Jew, that's my identity, I'm sticking with it. Anything you ask me about my identity, you're just going to get more information about Orthodox Judaism. And then sometimes you could transcend that, where saying Orthodox Judaism is just one facet of my multifaceted identity. And hopefully Dooovid and Luke, studied enough Torah or been through enough where our identity is multifaceted, where there's a large portion of our identity. If people, you're just going to be like, this is who I am because I'm an Orthodox Jew, but then there's going to be significant parts of our identity that is like, because this is the family I was born into, this is the circumstances under which I was raised and trained, and this is my experiences, and this is my present state challenges, what me and Jennifer would refer to as the current state of karma.
And let me read more here from the book The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. If you find yourself criticizing other people, you're probably doing it out of resistance. When we see others beginning to live their authentic selves, it drives us crazy if we have not lived out our own. Individuals who are realized in their own lives almost never criticize others if they speak at all. It is to offer encouragement. The more scared we are of a work or a calling, the more sure we can be that we have to do it. Grandiose fantasies are a symptom of resistance. They are the sign of the amateur. The professional has learned that success, like happiness, comes as a byproduct of work. The professional concentrates on the work. Resistance knows that the more psychic energy we expend dredging and redredging the tired, bored injustices of our personal lives, the less juice we have to do our work. Seeking support from friends and family, it's like having your people gathered around you at your deathbed. Any support we get from persons of flesh and blood is like monopoly money. It's not legal tender in that sphere where we have to do our work. The more energy we spend stoking up on support from colleagues and loved ones, the weaker we become and the less capable of handling our business. The seeming detachment of the professional, the cold-blooded character to his demeanor, is a compensating device to keep him from loving the game so much that he freezes in action. Resistance wants us to cede sovereignty to others. It wants us to stake our self-worth, our identity, our reason for being on the response of others to our work. Resistance knows we can't take this. No one can. Any thoughts, Dooovid?
Yeah, so you can't argue with results, generally. Like President Trump, to me, that's a little beyond Jewish norms of acceptance, kind of saying like we're not all about winning. But that level, like nothing argues with success. And there's certain, enlightenment principles, being humble, that are constantly important, and not getting off track, or the more success a person has, the more dangerous arrogance and not having humility could be. But that's, I think me and Luke are in full agreement on this. Measure ourselves by practical things, and if you're doing good, it should be obvious because you're getting good feedback from other people, and that doesn't necessarily mean like how many viewers you're getting on YouTube, although that also in relationship, like there's probably some sort of reciprocal relation, but like more how your relationships with your loved one, your family, the people we deal with on a regular basis.
Right. Let me play more here from Professor Aaron W. Hughes. He's the chair of Jewish Studies, and he at his University of Rochester, and he's also a specialist in Islam.
The crux of kind of your many of your arguments is the kind of the historicity of these sources. Now, a book that you find to be successful, kind of using these sources, is Fred Donner's Muhammad and the Believers. I'm wondering if you could talk about why you feel like Donner's book was successful versus some of these other presentations.
Yeah, well, Donner's is. I have a problem with everything. I have a problem with Donner's for another. Donner is much more sophisticated in the sense, and I think more realistic in the sense that he would have said that Muhammad would have had this very exclusive or a very inclusive message that would have appealed to all sorts of other monotheists in the area, and that only gradually did something that we now recognize as Islam coalesce into that. My problem with Donner, though, is the way he uses the category religion. The way he talks about religion, he talks about from the vantage point of the 20th century, and uses all the rhetoric of religion that people in religious studies like McCutcheon, Lincoln, Smith are so critical of. So whereas I think I like Donner's nuanced portrayal of what Muhammad's message might have looked like in the 7th century Arabia, I'm critical of his use of terms like spirituality, like religious fervor, etc. These are, again, I think these are an imposition of terms.
Sure. This might also stem from kind of institutional affiliations and departmental divisions, of course.
Yeah.
So one of the other kind of thing that is addressed in this chapter and arises in several other places is that part of why many of these books become authoritative is not only because they are often believing Muslims, but more so because of their institutional affiliation. They're authorities because they're academics, right? So could you talk a little bit about this relationship of where, I guess, scholar believers can approach this type of work? I mean, you might think that they shouldn't do this type of work, but is there a place for this kind of participant, observer, insider position from academics?
Let me come at that from a couple of angles. The first thing is, you're right, is that the majority of the books that I'm critical of, the names of many of the scholars are, Ramadan, Safi, Afsaruddin. The books that I tended to like more were written by Powers, Donner, Shoemaker. So you're right that there's a real tension within Islamic studies between those who are Muslims and those who are not Muslims. That's not to say that a Muslim can't be critical of his or her own tradition, or that a non-Muslim can't write in a way that's simply valorizing the terms of the tradition. I don't want to step into that binary. But the majority of the books written by Muslims on Muhammad are written by, I guess, did you call them scholar theologians? Is what
I said participant observers. I think that's one of the words you used.
Okay, participant observers, right. Then this is, and again, I have absolutely no problem with any of those books. My problem is that they're based on a categorical mistake, and that is they claim to be works of religious studies that are written by scholars of religion who are employed by state universities, paid by government monies, to teach non-Muslims and Muslims about the Islamic tradition. But they're not doing that. They're writing as theologians. They're writing as insiders, and they're trying to they're not being honest about the sources. And the result is that religious studies, Islamic religious studies, much like Buddhist studies or even Jewish study or other traditions, risks becoming a platform for liberal theologizing. Now, what I've always said is if we're going to do theology, we should just call it theology. I have nothing against theology. I have a problem with theology when it masquerades as the academic study of religion. And I don't think people are being clear. So when you say that the Muhammad you're presenting is going to be the authentic Muhammad, and that you've read all the sources, you have to follow that up and say, well, these sources date from a much later period, and they're not eyewitness accounts, and that we can't get at an authentic Muhammad. That every community historically, synchronically, diachronically creates a Muhammad in their own image, much like followers of Jesus do, much like Jews do with the concept of halakha and observance.
Okay, so I'm looking at a great tweet here from Rob Henderson. He says, much of Twitter involves the upper class dunking on working class people for not being aware of elite manners and social customs. I think that's a great point from Rob Henderson. Okay, Dooovid, anything you heard you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think this might be interesting because, hopefully we're going to go more into Jewish studies, but looking at the Islamic studies, and I think Hughes is kind of missing the larger picture where what is true is really only what's important to him. To the larger picture, no one really cares what is true or not. Saying in the topic of today's show, what's a life that works? People generally care what works, and the purpose of Islamic studies is not to publish papers that are true. According to academic rigor, the purpose of Islamic studies is it has multiple purposes, and we could discuss that. But I think Hughes might be missing some, genre mistake or whatever you're saying, that where he might theoretically be correct, but he's saying they don't have Islamic studies, they don't have Judaic studies departments so that people could know the truth about Judaism. And, historically, that's why they didn't have these studies at all. And when they created these departments, they weren't really about coming for truth, and that's probably a big topic. And I was thinking the business aspect, because if you're part of a religion, rabbis are a big part of our life. Saying the synagogues, they do family cycle ceremonies, and I was saying you're only as big as the rabbi you get behind. You can't be as big as the Jewish scholar you get behind, because the Jewish scholar doesn't do weddings and bar mitzvahs, and doesn't have a synagogue in most cases. But from the Jewish perspective, I like the Judaism that the person in Jewish studies is saying more than I like what the rabbi is saying. In Islamic studies, this is basically what Hughes is saying is saying about Islam. And probably Islam, I'm postulating about business, is largely a commerce relation. So within Judaism, you could have a democratizing process of the businessmen falling behind rabbis that give them the rulings and opinions that they want. And that's probably what's happened in Islam. Kind of what Hughes is saying is that the people that are successful, and I know the Imam Kazemi of Detroit, the biggest mosque in America, I believe, spoke at university. He told some story about his one of his big donors that has this huge liquor chain and multiple liquor stores, and he came to the imam because he was worried about his daughter who's studying pet psychology. And he gives a little explanation, at least to the university students, well, actually, according to Islam, there's nothing wrong with pet psychology, but selling alcohol is a big problem. But relatively, it's American. That guy's one of his biggest donors, and donors have a certain amount of effect. And so the Jewish studies, any religious studies, hard to know your place. And you're just saying I'm basically a nobody that writes books for the academy that nobody reads. And then if you think Steven Pinker and, the books that become public and widespread, your big authors, Jordan Peterson, they become popular because they tell people largely what works and what helps them have a better life. And usually the academic truth isn't what works and helps people have a better life, even though it's extremely important. So, I don't know if I'm applying what you're saying as a genre mistake, or if you even want to philosophize, what role is the studies department at all in, so to say, changing? And probably Islam is easier to look at than Judaism. And you think the issues like white privilege, Jews having been in America longer, that there's much more pressure on Muslims than there is on Jews. Relatively, Dooovid gets to walk around like this, no problem. Muslims, would have a lot more problems than Dooovid does. And so Islamic studies has to put out there. They're not trying to write the truth about Muhammad. They're trying to help Muslims, have better success in America. Or is it the opposite? And Hughes is right. He's like, I demand the truth. I demand that you write things that are absolutely true according to the academics, and so and so on. But at that point, then it's like it should be anthropology, because he's saying, I'm sorry, I'm from a false religion and a false history, so let me just write according to anthropology and evolution why my ancestors believed in this nonsensical stuff, and today how we could try to change these people who believe in this nonsensical stuff due to historical reasons into becoming more adaptable to the liberal norms of society. So I'm enjoying Hughes quite a bit.
Okay, great, thanks. Let me play a little bit more from Aaron Hughes.
The next section, you revolve around some of the same figures, and specifically John Esposito. The kind of the catalyst, it seems, for this second section is that John Esposito is going to be the forthcoming AAR president. But this section also brings up broader issues revolving around the role of the scholar of Islam. So I'm wondering if you can kind of begin your discussion on this topic, on how is the research of an Islamicist affected when they must step into a public discourse often about Islam, and what might be what is a public audience expecting of a scholar of Islam? And you've talked about this a little bit in your own experience. Maybe you could elaborate.
No, you're right. It's a very tough question. I sometimes think that if 9/11 had never happened, what scholarship in Islamic studies would have looked like. It seems that there were a lot of people doing really good things that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 stopped doing that and began to apologize. I don't mean that in a negative way, but began to stick up for the tradition. And look, I mean, I'd be the first to the way public discourse in this country deals with Islam, I think is absolutely sickening and horrendous. When Muslims can't, there's all kinds of objections to Muslims putting up a mosque in Tennessee or California or wherever. I think this is absolutely disgusting. But having said that, I think that the scholar of Islam or scholars of Islam need to be clear on boundaries. Now, obviously, you can't go into an interview talking, and you can't nuance things in an interview the way you can in your writing. Sure. And so the question is, I think this would be a good workshop for the study of Islam section at the AR. Maybe the time has passed because we're so far on from 9/11, but I don't think the problematic that informs that we were still there. And that is, how do we deal with the media? How can we deal with the media in a way that respects the canons of scholarship, and at the same time, we can make informative judgments based on living with the tradition for the past, however many years, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. So it's a great challenge, and I'm not sure how to do it. When I would do it, I would always make it clear under which hat I was wearing. Am I speaking as a scholar of Islam? Because if I'm speaking as a scholar of Islam, I will say something much different than if I'm here to defend Islam against various neoconservative criticisms. And again, it's the slippage that I'm uncomfortable with. The slippage from the scholar to the practitioner and vice versa. The slippage from religious studies to theology. So I always want to try and, I guess, patrol that boundary.
Yeah. So moving specifically to Esposito, you're critical about Esposito's work throughout the book.
Yeah.
And one of the big critiques you have is this dichotomy he creates, which is not specific to Islamic studies, but this relationship between religion and culture. Could you kind of just talk about this more generally from a religious studies perspective? What happens when we start using this kind of rhetoric of culture versus religion?
I mean, I think I speak from the position in religious studies that religion is a nonsensical term, that there's no such thing as religion, that all there is cultural formations. So right away then, I mean, there's even historical reasons for this, right? I mean, most cultures of the globe don't have the term religion. The fact that scholars of religion go in and, carve out this thing and say, this is religion, so it's now divorced from all kinds of cultural, social, intellectual, gendered context, just really makes me really uncomfortable. And so, and I've written a lot about that. So right away then, I think religion is a folk taxon of the largely Christian Protestant West that we have imposed on other cultures and forced them to speak about themselves in ways that we in our hubris feel good about. So the religion culture dichotomy, I would say that there's no such thing as religion. There's simply cultural constructions. So if I say there's a difference between religion and culture, that assumes that religion exists somewhere independently of culture, which it doesn't. So when Esposito will say, well, we know that Islam as a religion does not condone X, but X happens in places like rural Pakistan or rural Jordan. This shows that it's the culture, but not the religion. And I'm not comfortable with that because the two don't exist independently of one another. And I think it's hubris on his part to say that the people who do X in rural Pakistan or rural Jordan or wherever don't understand their tradition properly.
Yeah. And I don't.
Okay, let me get any reactions, Dooovid.
Yeah, I'm not so. I think I'm largely coming out to disagree with him, especially about Islam. But that probably, like me, take his approach towards Judaism, um, because I take a believer's perspective, and that's why I said like it went. And from what he's saying, if what he's saying is true, then there is no purpose for a separate department of religious studies. Religious studies, is could be studied in culture in the Department of Cultural Studies, or anthropology, or archaeology. What is separately coming from studying religion? So I'm not, and maybe I haven't listened enough to him, but I'm not really sure. Saying what is the addition of religious studies? Like, why isn't religious studies a department of anthropology, according to what Hughes is saying? Why does it deserve its own department? And I also put in the chat, thinking about Islam, and the most popular books that Orthodox Jews read are Islamo bashing books, God forbid, that are written to counter these guys. Like, I know all these guys that he's talking about in the articles because I follow Israel and I watch academic stuff about the Middle East. And yeah, these are the guys who are experts that speak on panels at the Middle East, and largely probably advancing their ethnic national interest. So you have people. I was thinking like Brooke Goldstein. There's even a local woman near me who writes book, or like a Baal Tshuva to Orthodox Judaism. Her son's a good man, a lawyer, but she spends her time writing books bashing Islam, and trying to convince people that they need to know. And I think a lot of like Dennis Prager, Ben Shapiro, the type thing, like they're not in Islamic studies. They're more on the fear-mongering warning that like the West, America, Israel needs to know the truth about Islam because of political ramifications like immigration, or how we're going to structure society. And versus that angle. And then if that's true, what about Adam Green? And saying, is Adam Green really just no different than Brooke Goldstein, except he's examining Judaism? Is Adam Green no different than Aaron Hughes, except no one in Judeo studies takes a critical approach to Judaism except Adam Green? And Adam Green is reading all the literature coming out of Judeo studies, and he's like, why doesn't someone address the fact that the Jews believe that they're going to run the world someday? And he was saying, oh, all the scholarship that's debunked and debunked. And so it's interesting the nature of this probably Western Gentile who has a relatively favorable view towards Judaism, and what would appear to be a less favorable view towards Islam. And I'm taking that in his nature, what he's calling true. And even Shapiro in that thing where he was like, everyone would agree that the best scholars, are the blue-eyed men. The Spartan don't produce any big scholars. Like, what books have they written? And so you could look at it in different ways. Like, but it's a similar statement that probably someone in in a religious studies department, generally they're enemies of Islam, and they're going to let Jews and Christianity largely paint what we do in a positive light and not push back. And someone like Adam Green comes out and is like, that's not Judeo studies, that's just pampering and pondering to serve these people, and he's going to be put off. But guys like Aaron Hughes, they'll go all off on Islam, and at least in the academic studies department, that's still kosher. And like media and political correct, you have a lot more leeway to bash Islam than almost anything else out there.
Okay, any final words for today, Dooovid? I'm going to move on.
Yeah, great. I'm enjoying these conversations. We have to think about the streaming just in terms of you've really stimulated me to research areas that I don't research, because no one ever really talks about these things. I love reading books. I've spent my whole life reading books on these type subjects, and maybe me and Luke are similar, and we've been able to clarify like why generally we're not fulfilling this demand within our Orthodox Judaism, and so I'm enjoying these conversations. Hopefully we could create circles of people that enjoy these conversations, and have a great Sabbath.
Okay, take care, Dooovid. Good to talk to you. Okay, interesting article in the New York Times here. just came out. Abolish the police. Those who survived the chaos in Seattle aren't so sure. What is it like when a city abandons a neighborhood and the police vanish? Shockingly, business owners describe what experience do you think it's like for business owners when the police vanish? Do you think it's an invigorating and exciting and enlightening, a calm, happy experience, or harrowing? New York Times uses the word harrowing experience of calling for help and being left all alone. Faisal Khan, Seattle, Dateline Seattle. Faisal Khan was told by the news media and his own mayor that the protests in his hometown were peaceful with a block party atmosphere. But that was not what he saw through the windows of his Seattle coffee shop. He saw encampments overtaking the sidewalks. He saw roving bands of masked protesters smashing windows and looting. Young white men wielding guns would harangue customers, as well as Mr. Khan, a gay man of Middle East descent who moved here from Texas so he could be more comfortable out as a homosexual. To get into his coffee shop, he sometimes had to seek the permission of self-appointed armed guards to cross a border they had erected. They barricaded us all in here, Mr. Khan said, and they were sitting in lawn chairs with guns. So, by and large, the gay community are big fans of the police. They have excellent contacts with the police. They count on the police because gays often lead gentrification. For 23 days in June, about 6 blocks in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood were claimed by left-wing demonstrators and declared police-free. Protesters hailed it as liberation from police oppression from white supremacy and a catalyst for a national movement. This has left small business owners as lonely voices in progressive areas, arguing that police officers are necessary and that cities cannot function without a robust public safety presence. Who would have thought? In Minneapolis, Seattle, and Portland, Oregon, many of those business owners consider themselves progressives, and in interviews they express support for the Black Lives Matter movement, but they also worry that their businesses, already debilitated by the coronavirus pandemic, will struggle to survive if police departments and city governments cannot protect them. On Capitol Hill, business crashed as the Seattle police refused to respond to calls to the area. Officers did not retake the region until July 1st after 4 shootings, including 2 fatal ones. Now a group of local business owners, including a locksmith, the owner of a tattoo parlor, a mechanic, the owners of a Mexican restaurant, and Mr. Khan, are suing the city. The lawsuit claims that Seattle's unprecedented decision to abandon and close off an entire city neighborhood, leaving it unchecked by the police, unserved by fire and emergency health services, and inaccessible to the public, resulted in enormous property damage and lost revenue. Back to Aaron W. Hughes.
I don't really know how to phrase this as a question, but it brings up a point that you kind of touch upon throughout the book, that this idea that when introducing Islam, capital I, as a religion, the whole spectrum of voices needs to be positioned, I guess.
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, it's you're so right. We have to say that, and this is the problem with religion, is that we assume Islam is a religion, so therefore it has to be this unified monolithic voice. Whereas Islam, like any other tradition, I prefer to speak of Islams or Christianities or Buddhisms or Judaisms, is a symphony of instruments, to switch metaphors from voices to instruments, and we have to pay attention to those, because if not, we again fall into the problem that Esposito does, as saying that he knows, right, this non-Muslim white guy teaching at Washington D.C., that he is the arbiter of what is authentic Islam and what is real Islam and how religious Islam differs from cultural. There's too many hula hoops there, and again, it goes back to a couple of terms that I've mentioned earlier. We have to be honest about what we're doing, and we are scholars, so we have to, I probably sound old-fashioned about, when I talk about the canons of scholarship and objectivity and all this kind of stuff. I try to point out the unobjectivity of people, all the way trying to maintain my own objectivity, which of course is an impossible thing, but hey, we have to try to speak from somewhere. But I do take seriously the canons of scholarship. To be a scholar is to be a profession, and we can't fib, and we can't bend the truth, and we can't do these sorts of things all in the name of a good story, or all in the name of portraying Islam in a way that reflects our own sensibilities. So what I try to do is, as you said, is to, in the very introductory classroom, how can you account for the diversity of Islam without making us the arbiters, the judges of what is real Islam and what is unreal or fake Islam. And this is why groups like Al-Qaeda are so fascinating in the classroom, is because, we're so quick to say that this is not good or real Islam, whereas the people that are doing this, the members of Al-Qaeda, see themselves as quite simply the true, the best Muslims. We could say the same thing about Zionism and Judaism, or militant Hinduism, etc. So we have to think about Islamic religious studies in a way that will allow us to nuance. And this is why I can't write as a scholar, a participant observer, because I think if we write as a participant observer, we write as insiders, and we ultimately write as theologians. And when we write as theologians, we want to try to convince people of something. And this is why with the book, I don't know if you're going to get to that, but I was quite critical of the book Rethinking Islamic Studies by Carl Ernst and Richard Martin, and the collection of essays therein, because too many they portray the book as the future of Islamic studies. And someone like you should be worried, Christian, because I don't know if you're a Muslim, and if you're not a Muslim, I don't know how you fit in this type of discourse that they're trying to. So what they're trying to do, the essays in that volume are trying to say no longer is Orientalism a valid form of religious studies. This is now the bête noire of the field. Whereas there's some Orientalist scholarship that is absolutely first-rate. People like Powers, people like Shoemaker, I'm sure that these people would call themselves, I would have no problems calling themselves Orientalists. The majority of essays in that volume are written by Muslims, and they're not critical. I would say they're post-critical. And I guess we now live in a world of post, right? Postmodern, post-critical, post-Orientalist, what's the word I'm looking for? Post-colonial. And I'm worried that in all these posts, it's all identity politics.
Let's.
Okay, here is a quick little video on Vaush.
So Vaush has, quote unquote, called me out. Well, please let me respond. Yes, Vaush, everyone who disagrees with you is a Nazi, and this isn't getting tired in any way, shape, or form. You notice that's something you have to do, continually call people Nazi rather than produce some kind of solid argument? And you, again, resort to pettiness like, nobody likes his theory. Well, it's not even my theory, to be perfectly honest, because it came before me. But, you should probably ignore the people in the third world who support the LCOs, third worldism, or maybe the people in the first world that actually support me. But, what would be the point of that? The fact is, you really are a terrible excuse for a human being. I'm not afraid to go on your show and call you what you are to your face. By the way, right there in the description of this video is the link to you sexually harassing a 14-year-old girl. And yeah, that really does make you a complete greaseball for doing that. As for having me debate you, debate what? Debate like you debated Caleb Maupin, you had him come on your show and you just called him a Nazi the whole time, and then claimed that everybody who fought and struggled against the Nazis were Nazis themselves. I mean, we can kind of see the logic here. The conservatives do that all the time. You know who the real fascists are? It's the anti-fascists. You know who's really racist? It's the anti-racists who are really racist. So we're already well aware of this this kind of mentality that you seem to share with conservatives. But as for the liberalism thing, well, yeah, you keep doing liberalism. You know that thing where you steer people away from revolution towards voting for Joe Biden? That's liberalism. That's pretty much the definition of it. Now, I'm pretty sure that would be like the best modern anti-Marxist liberalism right there. You know why? Because for you, socialism is a secondary goal, which comes from your utilitarianism. You don't put socialism first.
If you heard Richard Grove on episode 448, you heard him talking about his autonomy.
Very attractive to imagine this perpetual motion device where you can have something that is coherent, that is orderly, but that is not governed, that where no one is ruling. Because one of the things that does is it really appeals to this sense in people that to not be ruled is the first step toward ruling. So, Hobbes writes about, no one really wants the desolate freedom of the wild ass. What they mean when they say they want freedom is they want basically power. They may mean power over themselves or their own communities, but they're always asking for power. And so to overthrow another power or to have no power above you is a very, very good feeling. It really feels good to your kind of inner chimpanzee because it shows that you're like a chimpanzee on the rise, right? So this idea of being governed by a system which does not have to be trusted rather than people who you have to place your faith in and obey and follow is very, very attractive. So this accounts for a lot of the attraction of the model of the marketplace of ideas, right? So the question is, when I look at this system, it's like looking at the blockchain. I'm like, okay, here's a system that purports to evolve the best possible ideas. Okay, it's a system, and obviously we depend for our safety on those being good ideas. So the question is, can the system be hacked? Can it be perverted into basically being something that actually generates bad ideas? Or maybe does it even need to be hacked? Is it even secure at all? Is the first question to ask. And so when you ask this question, okay, how can the marketplace of ideas be hacked? How can it be exploited? How can it be perverted? Software security researchers, when they talk about hacking, have this concept of a weird machine, where you're basically hacking a system, hacking any like operating system. You're basically turning it from something that does the behavior that it's expected to do into a system that does something its designers never intended it to do. So, when you think about the U.S. Constitution, you can kind of, I think reflect a little on that, right? So the question is this an unhackable system, the marketplace of ideas? And here's a couple of ways you can hack it. So a very traditional way of hacking it is by coercion. And so you can simply say, okay, we have a marketplace of ideas, but if you publish ideas that the information minister doesn't like, the SA will come to your house and beat you up. Presto, that is simply another selective pressure on the marketplace of ideas, and it says that ideas that will anger the information minister have are strongly selected against, and therefore this is not a marketplace of ideas. It is simply a marketplace of it is not a marketplace of ideas that is judged by how true and good these ideas are. It is a marketplace of ideas judged by what pleases the information minister. Now, these connections are a little easy to trace. People might not like the information minister for that. So what we're going to do next, this is actually totally routine in Europe, by the way, also in Latin America, is we're going to use positive means. And so the information minister is going to basically subsidize, often through covert means, often just openly, the institutions of media that he likes. Never forget that Orwell wrote 1984 after working at the BBC, right? Somehow no one is like, oh, state press, just like Viktor Orban, right? It's actually not like Viktor Orban. It works in a completely different way. So, Viktor Orban would basically subsidize the press, but Viktor Orban is a monarch. And the most important thing to understand about where we are is that our system, there are three forms of government, which are sort of forms of political power, or ways that political power can express itself. These are monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. Or in other words, people power, network power, organized power. And so the question of how you juke the marketplace of ideas, how you hack the marketplace of ideas in a monarchy is the question that we're used to thinking about. We're like, oh yeah, Hitler did this, and then he just closed the competing presses, or a more crafty despot will subsidize the papers he likes, or Orban is a perfect example because he's basically consolidated the Hungarian media using only sort of legal, semi-legal methods, right? But he still basically created this very classic soft one-party right-wing state in Europe in the 21st century. I don't think it'll last, but there it is. But that's and of course, people would, scream bloody murder if Trump somehow started doing this. Like if the Trump fortune, imagine Trump gets elected and then he starts buying newspapers, You have
in Israel, the newspapers are all privately owned, and Sheldon Adelson gives his away.
Yeah, right. And suddenly, you have a subscription to the Washington Post, and you wake up and it's the Trump Post. So that's that's the sort of the pre-modern way of solving this problem. It's ugly and it kind of doesn't have legs. But actually, that's not at all the way the world works today, and that's not at all what creates this imbalance in power. So what we've established so far is that there are basically two ways of jinxing the information marketplace. You can do it by coercion, or you can do it by reward. But we've only discussed centralized reward. Okay, now we get into the more advanced graduate level topic of decentralized reward. The way that decentralized reward works is that you have a state that leaks. So it leaks, essentially it's leaking power. And concretely what that means is that it's leaking information and it's leaking influence. So if it's leaking information, obviously shit comes out the building that doesn't come out the front door. And you know how Apple feels about it when shit comes out of the building that doesn't come out the front door. And the second thing that it's leaking that Apple also, by the way, doesn't leak is influence. So basically, you can't imagine.
Okay, my buddy Ricardo is back. He asked Luke, what is the connection between Satanism and non-religious chosen people? I don't believe there's any such thing as Satanism. I am a monotheist, therefore I don't believe that there is any power independent of God, and that includes, I don't believe in any devil, right? So I don't believe in Satanism, I don't believe in a devil, Judaism does not believe in a devil, and so I believe that the only power independent of God in the universe is the human being, and that the human being has an urge to do good and an urge to do bad. And often it's a lot easier just to do bad. So the chat is very annoyed with YouTube automatically deleting posts, and unfortunately there's nothing I can do about that, but I hope the day will come soon when we can live stream on BitChute. Okay, here's a video.
Hello, folks. So I came across this article on Vice today, which deals with the topic of gentrification. Now, I'm offering my commentary on this article because I think it illuminates in a fantastic manner the psychology of the modern white person. Indeed, the article reveals a disorder which I have dubbed anthropological passivity. Now, anthropological passivity is an affliction which is brought about in a person when that person feels that they themselves do not belong to or are not allowed to belong to a cultural group. This person who is denied an inherent culture will usually feel uneasy and empty, so they'll search for an alien culture that they can try to mimic in order that they may be taken in and accepted by that group. However, commonly the alien culture will deny entrance to this cultural immigrant, usually for reasons of inauthenticity of the immigrant or complaints of cultural dilution caused by this immigrant's entry into their culture. Now, after this person is rejected entry into this cultural group, this person will, over time, begin to think of themselves as otherized from identity and culture itself. Indeed, this person will begin to believe that culture is just a thing possessed by other peoples, and not themselves. In fact, this person will begin to believe that their presence amongst scenes of culture only serves to destroy that culture. This person will begin to see themselves as a cultural cancer. This person will be forced to live their life like an anthropologist, left only to watch others enjoy their cultural identities and values. And this cultural observer will have to observe from afar, through music videos, movies, books. For this anthropologist knows his destructive nature. He knows that if he observes too close, the culture he observes might be destroyed. The observed might become the observer. So the anthropologist has to make their presence as little known as possible, for they don't want to disturb an authentic scene. The anthropologists must pacify themselves if they want to see beautiful scenes of cultural authenticity survive. This, then, is anthropological pacification. Now, this absence of cultural and racial identity is something which has grown significantly amongst whites since World War II. This is due to the fact that America's participation in World War II cemented a new American foundational myth. Since America had a tradition of staying out of the wars of Europe, the American media had to try to justify America's entrance into the war. They had to make the war an ideological one, so the media began to juxtapose American values with those values of the nationalistic Axis powers that America fought against. And since the Axis powers placed precedence on things like racial and familial heritage, preservation of traditional cultural norms, historical reverence, and so forth, America had to slowly purge itself of these tendencies. Thus, American academia was purged of any biological and evolutionary perspectives in the social sciences, and replaced by radical environmentalism. The sole purpose of these academics was to criticize and deconstruct Western identity. These academics deconstructed racial and ethnic identity, sexual and familial identity, religious identity, and yet these academics never offered anything to replace these things, which they destroyed. And to further deconstruct Western identity, these academics suggested that these fallacious Western identities were actually oppressive constructs. Thus began the great modern white crusade to wipe from the face of the earth that horrible oppressive thing called Western identity. And since racial categorizations were fraudulent as well, any inequalities between the races were only because of deceit and oppression, and therefore needed to be wiped away as well. Thus, the white man's burden could only be resolved by eliminating the white man. The white man's burden became the very existence of the notion of the white man's burden. Now that we have this general outline of what I wish to speak on, let's jump on into this Vice article. The title of the article is How Woke Liberals Convince Themselves That Gentrifying is Okay, and it has a cute subtitle. As a gentrifier myself, I decided to study how we justify what we're doing. The article begins, in 2015, my college roommates and I shared the top half of a brownstone in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood. Historically black, Bed-Stuy has been rapidly gentrifying over the past few decades, a transition made visible in the juxtaposition of discount calling card stores and vegan juice bars. In 1980, Bed-Stuy's population was only 5% white, and median gross housing rent was $580. By 2012, the white population had jumped to 17%.
Here's a new ad from the Trump campaign.
Highly critical, biased text messages between senior FBI officials Peter Strzok and Lisa Page.
There will be no question about the outcome of this election.
And she got ahead of herself. This utterly stunned this campaign.
Head home. You should get some sleep. We'll have more to say tomorrow.
Our constitutional democracy enshrines the peaceful transfer of power.
The peaceful transition of power is one of the hallmarks of our democracy. We want to do everything we can to help you succeed, because if you succeed, then the country succeeds.
These declassified documents that were just released.
Officials in the Obama administration were asking for the identities to be unmasked of Americans.
Unmasking of aides and staffers of the incoming president.
The basic charge, political spying.
To disrupt the peaceful transfer of power.
Unmasking of American citizens. It could be a real problem.
Why is it that the unmasking of Flynn somehow ended up in the pages of the Washington Post?
I know nothing about those moves to investigate Michael Flynn.
The vice president said that yesterday, and then the last name on this list is Joe Biden.
The Obama administration was bitter. They wanted to do everything they could to undermine the incoming Trump administration.
Really designed to sabotage and really upend the new administration.
Still speaking at a news conference in New Jersey. We've got a full show for you tonight, but we're going to dip back in for just a moment. We'll be right back.
And anarchists, that's what they are.
You know, when you find Molotov cocktails in somebody's knapsack and they say, no, I'm just here to have a good time. These are really sick, disturbed people. The disgraced mayor of the city has ordered the police to stand down in the face of rioters, leaving his citizens at the mercy of this mob. He was at the mercy of the mob, too. If you saw him go out there the other day, it was terrible. He went out there and they wanted to rip him apart. But fortunately, he had 5 people with him, called security. Mayor Wheeler has abdicated his duty and surrendered his city to the mob. As a result, the mob descended upon a police precinct and tried to burn it down, tear it down, rip it down, an act of attempted murder. Left-wing violent extremism poses an increasing threat to our country, and we stop it. You have no idea how much we stop, but it's an ideology we have to stop. When you commit arson, this is a quote from the mayor. He's come a long way, just made this quote. When you commit arson with an accelerant in the attempt to burn down a building that is occupied by people who have intentionally been trapped inside, you're not a demonstrator or you're not demonstrating, said Mayor Whelan. You are attempting to commit murder. That's come a long way. He's come a long way when he made that statement. What you're seeing in Portland is the radical left's agenda in action. Portland is their roadmap for America. If the radical left gets in and they treat Joe Biden as a puppet, he's merely a puppet. But if the radical left gets in, they look at Portland as a thing that they want. That's what they want. Why? Who knows? Doesn't matter. It's a different thinking, but it's a mess. And I want to thank Homeland Security. They've done a fantastic job. We had our people go in. They stopped any intrusion into the courthouse, and the courthouse was saved, and other federal buildings were saved. And we would like to be asked by the mayor and the governor. We will go in and stop the problems in Portland in 24 hours, just like we did in Minneapolis after they really hurt that city. But the National Guard went in and did a phenomenal job. It was over in 3 hours. After watching 6 days of horror, it ended in 3 hours. You all saw the scene of them walking right down the street. It was actually an unfortunate view, but an incredible view of how to do things. So we would be able to solve the Portland situation immediately, but we are supposed to be asked. If we're not asked and if it continues, we'll have to make a decision. But it's a very easy thing for us to do. We could stop it very quickly. It's been going on now for 76 days. But our buildings are very secure. If the Democrats controlled in Washington, the Democrats' control of Washington, they'd pass, with all of the things they do, legislation gutting every single police department in America. They truly do. Many of these people want to defund the police department. At a minimum, they're going to stop money from going to the police department, but in many cases, they actually want to defund completely the police department. No city, no town, and no suburb would be safe. Your suburbs would be a disaster. Your cities, your towns would be a disaster. They want every city to be a Portland or to be a Chicago, which is totally out of control, and we're waiting for the mayor. We've sent people in to help them from an intelligence standpoint, but we're waiting for them to call the governor, the mayor. We could do a very good job in Chicago. Nobody's ever seen anything like that in this country. And yet, nationwide, numbers are good despite the Chicagos and the Portlands, and frankly, the New Yorks, when you look at what's happened in New York. 348% increase in the last number of months. Nobody's seen anything like that. It's so sad. To me, it's so sad because I love New York, and it's so sad. And all it is horrible, horrible, incompetent management by politicians that truly don't know what they're doing. So just like we saved the courthouse, we will save the United States of America. And a vast majority of people agree with me, a vast majority. Most people. They don't speak up as much as they could, but we know they're there, and everybody else knows they're there, too. So with that, I'll take a few questions from the media. They've been here for a long time, and they've been waiting outside for a long time, and they wait for these moments. It's always a lot of fun. Please, go ahead. No, you, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. I have a couple of questions on the negotiations with Capitol Hill on the coronavirus legislation. These executive orders you mentioned, do you have a timeline on when you're going to sign them, or?
Yeah, it could be by the end of the week. They're being drawn by the lawyers right now. They work very nicely. It would be nice to be able to do it with the Democrats, but they're really just interested in one thing, and that's protecting people that have not done a good job in managing cities and states, and nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with, or little to do. They want to be able to make up for many, many years, in some cases decades of bad management. We can't do that. So that's what they want. They want to do that, and we don't want to do that.
Are you concerned about the legality of these executive orders?
No, not at all. No, if somebody, well, you always get sued. I mean, everything you do, you get sued. I was sued on the travel ban, and we won. I was sued on a lot of things, and we won. So we'll see. Yeah, probably we get sued, but people feel that we can do it. Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, the intelligence agencies today said that Russia is already meddling in this year's election to hurt Joe Biden, and that China is considering meddling to hurt you. Do you believe that intelligence, and what do you plan to do about it?
It could be. I mean, I could be very much. I think that the last person Russia wants to see in office is Donald Trump, because nobody's been tougher on Russia than I have ever.
That's not what
well, I don't care what anybody says. Nobody with any common sense would say, do it. Look at what we've done with our military. Look at what we've done in exposing the pipeline with billions of dollars going to Russia. Look at all of the things we've done with NATO, where I've raised $130 billion a year from countries that were delinquent, and now they're paying all of this money. And the 130, by the way, $130 billion, not million, billion, goes to $400 billion over a few years. And that's all money to protect against Russia. China would love us to have an election where Donald Trump lost to Sleepy Joe Biden. They would dream. They would own our country if.
Okay, looking at the chat, looking at Twitter, the Church of Satan has tweeted there are many Jewish Satanists, including our founder Anton LaVey, who was raised in a secular Jewish household. So many, meaning probably less than 1% of Jews, probably less than 0.1% of Jews. I've never don't recall meeting a Jew who identified as a Satanist. Is very much a minority position. So I'm sure that there are people from Christian backgrounds who are Satanists, and from Jewish backgrounds, and from Muslim backgrounds, and from communist backgrounds, and fascist backgrounds, but very, very tiny numbers of people from a Jewish background identify as Satanist. And the chat says, how come Jared Taylor got kicked off Twitter, but the Church of Satan has a blue check mark? I guess because the Church of Satan is more socially acceptable than Jared Taylor. If Jared is banned for no reason, why'd they let Richard Spencer on? Well, maybe precisely because Jared comes across as much more reasonable than Richard Spencer. Maybe because Jared's optics are too good.
With big regulation cuts, we've rebuilt our military. We became independent in terms of energy. We're the energy leader of the world. We were having the best year we've ever had. By the way, African American, Asian American, Hispanic American unemployment numbers, the best in the history of our country. All things, and many other groups too, including women, including high school diploma, no high school diploma, college diploma.
President of the United States taking questions at a news conference in Bedminster, New Jersey. We'll continue to monitor that back and forth and bring it to you as news warrants. Topics under discussion, of course, the riots in the Pacific Northwest and around the country, foreign policy, Russia, China, North Korea, pipelines, all compelling, all things that are covered widely in the news. But at the same time in this country, there are a lot of things that don't get a lot of coverage. At this moment, the most compelling voice against abortion and Planned Parenthood is not a Republican. The most widely heard Christian evangelist in America is not ordained. Instead, he is a rapper married to a Kardashian, who, by the way, everyone says is crazy. Kanye West is running for president, but that's not really the headline. The headline is that on core conservative issues, not political issues like legislation before the Congress, but on foundational questions about life and children and what happens when you die, no one with a national platform has been more honest or sincere or effective than Kanye West has been, maybe in generations. It's all pretty shocking, really. Talk about an unlikely messenger. But it's real. Check out West's Twitter feed if you haven't seen it. Not everything he says is conservative, far from it. Not everything he says is even intelligible. But when West talks about his faith and about the gift of human life, you start to ask yourself, why aren't there any elected Republicans who sound like that? They say they believe the same things, but if they actually do, why don't they talk like Kanye West does? And the answer, of course, is because they're afraid to. But West is not afraid. He doesn't have to be. He's too famous. He's made too much money. He sold something like 150 million albums over the past 20 years. And really, it's hard to cancel a guy like that. So what does the left do in response to Kanye West? How do you make Kanye West shut up? The short answer is you can't, so you work to discredit him. You go ad hominem. You ignore what he's saying. You attack him as a person. You don't engage with his ideas. You know you would lose if you tried that. So instead, you try to keep people from listening to him. It's an easier job when you're dealing with less famous people. Thanks to our centrally controlled internet, the left can usually silence dissent in an instant with the press of a button. But with prominent wrong thinkers like Kanye West, censorship requires a finer touch, more artistic flair. When the author J.K. Rowling had the gall to note that biological sex is a physical reality, not just a state of mind, Google couldn't simply wipe her off the internet. She's J.K. Rowling. She created Harry Potter. So the left had to destroy her more methodically. One British news site compared Rowling to the anti-Semite Richard Wagner and then dismissed her as, quote, deeply unpleasant. So multiply that attack by hundreds of stories, and over time they are confident, and maybe they're right, that no one will ever listen to J.K. Rowling again. In Kanye West's case, they decided to attack him as mentally ill. You hear that a lot now, but it's a relatively new tactic. It was just a little over 4 years ago that CNN published a piece about Kanye West. They highlighted his most famous moments, like the time he interrupted Taylor Swift at the MTV Video Music Awards. CNN described all these incidents as, quote, controversial. But there was no mention of Kanye West being a danger to himself, much less mentally ill. No, just controversial. Not a problem. And then West appeared to say something positive about Donald Trump, and everything changed in an instant. Kanye West became a babbling lunatic, the kind of guy who pulls imaginary insects out of the air and soils his own pants. A total nutcase. Watch.
Kanye West's event on Sunday, and you saw,
right.
At least I saw a man clearly in trouble.
We met David Bowen, a Democratic state representative, earlier this summer. Bowen telling CNN, it's sad to see a popular music artist like Kanye be used as a pawn to trick his own people and fans.
Some new questions this morning about Kanye West's mental health after this tweet storm and so-called campaign rally.
You see that ignorance and asinine thought and behavior has been something that's risen to the top.
Whether a clearly vulnerable Mr. West is being used to try to siphon votes away from Joe Biden.
They're sad. They're concerned. He's in trouble. Oh, it's all so fake. The feigned concern, the oily fake empathy. Kanye is vulnerable, right? These people are actually worried, but they're not worried about Kanye West or his family. They don't care about them. They're worried about the threat that West poses to Democratic Party orthodoxy and therefore to their power. They don't say that out loud. They're liars. So instead, they continue to play the role of psychiatric nurse. Here's the guy whose job it is to get drunk on camera on New Year's Eve, letting Kanye West know that he's embarrassing himself and his dead mother.
What I saw was a minstrel show today. Him in front of all of these white people, mostly white people, embarrassing himself and embarrassing Americans, but mostly African Americans. And now all of a sudden, he is the person who represents the African American community. He doesn't. This was an embarrassment. Kanye's mother is rolling over in her grave.
He's defiling the memory of his mother. Sad. You'll notice that this group of cable news mental health experts may be deeply concerned about Kanye West, and yet for all of their apparent medical training, somehow they don't appear to notice that Joe Biden can no longer speak English. Joe's fine. He's not embarrassing anyone. Kanye West, by contrast, is deeply embarrassing to them, mostly because he's embarrassing to the Democratic Party. Here is someone who should be a Democrat calling out the most absurd lie that party tells. We care about black lives. That's why we want more abortion clinics in black neighborhoods. That's their position. It is insultingly stupid, and anyone who thinks about it knows that. When you love your kids, you want them to grow up and have children of their own. It's the main thing you want. But if your most consistent message to your children was, please end your pregnancy, they might start to wonder how you really felt about them. And Kanye West has started to wonder about that and things like that. Last month on Twitter, West wrote that he had, quote, cried at the thought of aborting my firstborn. I'm concerned for the world that feels you shouldn't cry about this subject. That's for sure.
My mom saved my life. My dad wanted to abort me. My mom saved my life. There would have been no Kanye West because my dad was too busy.
When was the last time you heard someone famous say something like that in public? Let's see, never. And then West went on to point out some of the more inconvenient facts that the progressive left wants you to forget. Quote, over 22,500,000 black babies have been aborted over the past 50 years, West tweeted. See, the media said, he's not well. Pray for him. Of course, what West said was factually true. What's also true is that Planned Parenthood was founded by someone who wanted fewer black people. That's why she founded Planned Parenthood. Her name was Margaret Sanger, and she once wondered aloud about the appearances of, quote, exterminating the Negro population, end quote. It's disgusting. You can find that on Google. West has. He knows it. And learning it clearly made him rethink his worldview. Here he is from a couple of years ago.
One of the moves that I love that liberals tried to do, the liberal would try to control a black person through the concept of racism because they know that we are very proud, emotional people. So when I said I like Trump to like someone that's liberal, they'll say, oh, but he's racist. You think racism can control me? Oh, that don't stop me. That's an invisible wall.
Oh, no wonder they hate him. Now, to be clear, Kanye West is not a normal person. And we're not saying he is. He has said out loud he sometimes suffers from something he calls a sprained brain. We're not sure what that is. We're not pretending to be mental health experts, and maybe Kanye West is crazy. We don't know. But it's also true, and wise people know this, that at a time like this, a lunatic time, sometimes it is only the crazy people who can see the world clearly. Lila Rose founded Live Action this afternoon. YouTube, by the way, censored one of her videos about abortion, not surprisingly, probably because it was true. She joins us tonight. Lila, thanks so much for coming on. So you think about this topic for a living. You articulate a position against it, and bless you for that, for a living. What do you make of Kanye West saying these things?
Yeah, well, he's getting a lot of pushback from a lot of media elites and politicians and those in entertainment because he's saying something that is true and that they refuse to acknowledge or reckon with, which is that abortion is the intentional and direct killing of an innocent human child. And he's expressing grief for the idea that in the past, when his then girlfriend was pregnant with his now 7-year-old daughter, that he thought about encouraging an abortion. And that grief is real. I think it's a shame for us to accuse it of just being crazy and write that off. That's real. But people are refusing to acknowledge it. And that's the real problem here, Tucker. There have been 60 million children killed since abortion was legalized in this country. 60 million children, sons and daughters. And there are mothers and fathers who are walking with.
Okay, here's an excerpt from Donald Trump's press
July
conference
1st,
today.
And so we're going to have the payroll tax go till the end of the year, and it'll be retroactive to July 1st. So we're going to go back to July 1st, and it'll go to the end of the year, payroll tax. At the end of the year, it may be extended. We're going to enhance unemployment benefits through the end of the year. So unemployment benefits will be, that's a big one, will be brought out to the end of the year, and defer student loan payments and forgive interest until further notice. So students who are paying student loans, and in many cases they're not even allowed to go back into their colleges, extend the eviction moratorium. We will.
And I'm just going to throw it to you. What was up with that picture on Instagram?
You know, it was weird because she's pregnant, so she couldn't get her pants zipped, and so I was like trying to I had on a pair of jeans that I haven't worn in a long time, so I couldn't get mine zipped either, and so I just put my belly out like hers, and it was just she's my wife's assistant, and she's a sweetheart, and I should never have put it up because it embarrassed her. Because anyway, I've apologized to everybody, and I promised my kids I'm going to try to be a good boy from here on out.
All right, so and this with this TV show, this Trailer Park Boys thing.
Yeah, whatever. It was just it was the costume party and we were on vacation, and anyway, long story short, it was just in good fun. That's it.
Okay, the Reverend Jerry Falwell sounds a little drunk there. Okay, let's find a nice song to end this show. How about I Vow to Thee, My Country? Sounds like a nice one. Let's wind things up for today.
Our second 10 is a patriotic anthem sung to the music of Gustav Holst.
Okay, good night, guys. God bless. Good Shabbos. Always remember the immortal words of Rabbi Leponius Maximus. You get far more money with a kind word and a bat than with just a kind word